Well, Dr. Farrell,
Oh, jeez.
we're getting a lot of moisture these days, and it's frustrating for producers because whenever the South gets its biscuits soggy, we get a drizzle up here, and I got to go to my desk back. So anyway, how's it down your way?
You look like you got that out of a very large drink, but anyway.
Well, this is my Mikado umbrella. Anyway, you got to be stylish for these events. When it's end of the world weather stuff, you don't want to go out with a plain black umbrella. What does that say? Everybody else.
Folks, that one took me entirely by surprise.
You just wish you had an umbrella this good.
No, I don't actually, but thank you.
I'm sure you have more flamboyant ones in your own collection.
No, I've got a
plain. Not all of us can have one with the Imperial German Eagle on.
No, it's a plain black umbrella. Thank you very much.
One day the Weimar will rise again. That kind of stuff.
Oh dear.
A waterproof crushable.
All right, I'm better now, folks.
So, well, Dr. Farrell, we are raining biscuits down along the coast, right? Highway of water along some of that stuff.
Yes.
I know you have theories about this.
Well, yes and no. It's weird as hurricanes go, but I think most people are probably familiar with what my problems with it are. But anyway, where were you going to go with this besides the umbrella?
Oh, I'm just acknowledging the weather because I'm getting it outside. It's really true. When there's flooding in the South, we get a drizzle up here, and I can't sit down on the porch and smoke a pipe. Waiting for the rest of us. Well, I wanted to bring up an interesting issue, skirting the issue of U.S. politics, which does nothing but divide. But I couldn't help but have a shall we say, nefarious thought that popped in my head the other day to describe thoughts that are like, I wonder if something's going on there. I saw that we cut off the last aid, or we're about to cut off the very last aid program to the Palestinians. It's like, that's it. All the programs are ending. Here's the last one, and we're going to cut that off too. And that's a really landmark set of choices there. And I couldn't help, immediately what popped into my head, as dumb as it may sound, is Madame Blavatsky and theosophy, the notion that there are senile races that are passing away and sort of deserve to perish. And then there are races that this is their time, this is their comeuppance. And I wonder if you think that there are any elements of theosophical thought that are starting to surface in much of this discussion around Israel and Palestine at this point. Because I could be smelling the wrong scent, but it just has that bouquet to me.
Wow, that's one I had never ever thought about.
I've heard like vague quasi-theosophical ideas coming from sort of the State Department, and then I saw this, and I'm like, if I was a theosophist, this is where I would be on the ground right now. Anyway,
right. Well, that's a very, very weird, interesting, intriguing observation. I haven't followed the story, to be honest with you, but just in general, theosophy and its idea of root races and so on. Let me put it this way. I think theosophy so permeated, if you look back at the 19th century, and I'm not trying to dodge the question. I'm just not familiar enough with the story to answer it in other than a very kind of general way. If you look back at theosophy, I think you have read those books by James Webb, the 2-volume study on the occult that he published years and years ago. And one of the things that he brings out, and this is something that I've just started to become interested in, is the permutation or permeation, I should say, of theosophical ideas in the 19th century throughout all of the spiritualist movements that were going on, the progressivist movements that were going on in Europe and in this country and so on, that did have they played very well to the kind of New England progressivist crowd in this country that went back to Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Addams family and so on and so forth. And they certainly percolated very heavily throughout English elements that were that way in the 19th century. So in a general way, I would not be surprised if many of those ideas kind of linger in some of those quarters and then percolate via, as James Webb tries to bring out, kind of percolate into the revivalist movement that's going on in the 1840s and so on in this country, that kind of spread out of New England into Western New York, and then from Western New York they spread after the Civil War. They percolate throughout the South of all places, so they become kind of to a certain extent, they kind of become entangled with various manifestations of evangelicalism in this country. And in a secular context, I think they permeate a lot of the thinking of the technocrats, the transhumanists, and so on and so forth, that have, to my mind, now that you raise the subject, I think it's a very interesting, intriguing observation, because you've got kind of similar theosophical ideas at work in the transhumanist movement. You know, the idea of improving humanity through genetics, eugenics, and so on, and improving humanity through computer technology and so on. So from that general sort of view, I wouldn't be a bit surprised to find that your observation may be true.
The reason I bring it up, so let's assume that the issue of Palestinian aid might be exaggerated, that so we're cutting the last of certain programs that in a certain bucket, but not necessarily the last of all Palestinian aid for all time. But nonetheless, the headlines read large, last of Palestinian aid gets cut. The reason I ask is not that particular news story per se, but because, if I were a theosophical believer, I would believe in the inevitability of the rise of big power spheres of people with a lot of resources and the decline of little power spheres with people that can't stand up to it. Mm-hmm. And this dovetails with a lot of what I've heard about sort of the declining Rust Belt, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But even outside of America, which populations matter and which populations don't, or can't cut it, or aren't cool enough, or don't have the resources. It's almost a fatalism combined with a realpolitik and balance of power that suggests, and when we talk about a body politic, we are inevitably talking about an ethnicity for most countries of the world. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about the Basque region, you're talking about the Basques. If you're talking about Portugal, you're talking about the Portuguese. Only in certain countries that are heavily, it's very seldom that you see this, but in melting pot countries, are we not equating national boundaries with ethnicity? So I see national boundaries as code for very often for ethnic claims. And when I see somebody say, this basically decide to take away the resources that would almost ensure the coexistence or the prolonged coexistence of a people, and make it so that there's no way that's going to happen, whether that is aid to refugees in Assyria, or it is rewind back to the breakup of Yugoslavia, or it's now with the Palestinians. I see people making decisions that ultimately those decisions determine which power center rises and which one declines and falls under the sway of the other. And I just think that's like a Madame Blavatsky dream right there, the ability to sort of decide, well, not just on the basis of self-interest, these people are financial and economic allies, but these people in some way are more worthy. And I can't help but wonder, as I see a lot of our discussion about health policy and vaccination and eugenics and so on, if Theosophy still lives and if it still plays a role in national decision making. Not that anybody ever brings it up anymore, but yes, it's precisely because
yeah, people don't bring it up anymore, and that's why I reference those. Mute your mic because I'm getting feedback. That's why I brought up those James Webb books for people to, if they're interested in the topic, to read, because he does point out the wide dissemination of theosophical ideas in the 19th century. And I think that you are probably onto something here, because now that you mention it, the intuition, I think, is sound, because those ideas were so widely disseminated. They were percolating through all manner of different places. Nikola Tesla picked up on a few of them. They were percolating at the Chicago exhibition in the late 19th century. They had conferences going. There were a number of American spiritualists that were heavily politically involved at the time. I mentioned Ralph Waldo Emerson, and that whole kind of secularized Calvinist movement in this country picked up a lot of these ideas in the late 19th century. So I think there's something sound here, but I want to caution people that I'm guessing that your intuition is sound. I haven't done any study of it. It would be an interesting study to see if that's really something going on. My suspicion is, now that you've mentioned this, that it's probably likely that you're going to find connections like this. As far as the Palestinians and Israel goes, the other problem there is that you've got the Zionist dreams of greater Israel and so on and so forth, and certainly under those political agendas, the Palestinians don't have much of a voice. And this goes back to the Chamberlain government in Great Britain that was trying to figure out a way to introduce a Jewish population into Palestine without upsetting the Palestinians that were already there, or for that matter, the Jews that were already there. And they came up with a quota system, which of course went by the wayside after the Second World War. So it's a difficult topic, but I wouldn't, on hearing your intuition, I wouldn't be inclined to write it off, quite frankly.
Well, the trickle of self-professing theosophists that are out there beat to it a little bit, because, but not much. I mean, I saw one post on Facebook where, which one can Google, that suggests that Donald Trump is a closet theosophist because, and is in favor of it.
Well, he may be,
because it's saying that Trump has come out and suggested that vaccines are linked to autism. And this is an original theosophical concept, that vaccines cause illnesses and are damaging. And so isn't this great for theosophy? So somebody did that. And somebody else linked theosophy to the birther conspiracy, the notion that that national origin was more important, not just for reasons of the Constitution, but reasons for whether you were in fact worthy of serving at the helm of one of the newest nations, based on that, and that this is a theosophical concept. But I don't see enough prima facie evidence there to make any conclusions myself. I was just curious because there was just that smell of that, like hey, somebody's cooking barbecue.
Yeah. Well, it is an interesting idea because, like I say, these ideas did percolate so widely throughout the 19th century, particularly in that region of the country. And for that matter, you've got Robert Kennedy Jr., who's on the anti-vaccine wagon. And I am as well, but not for theosophical reasons. But what I find interesting about the intuition here is that with such wide percolation of some of those ideas, you would have to trace the dissemination of them person by person. And we may be dealing with a case where people are basically repeating kind of a theosophical meme without even knowing that they are.
Well, this is why I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was basically more or less done. I've mentioned a book to some of the members here of the website previously that goes into a little bit of this this background in the spiritualist movement in the lead up to the American Civil War, a book that's called The Secret Six, which is a very interesting book to read. And it's clear if you compare that book with Blavatsky and some of these spiritualists that come later in the 19th century, that there's a definite connection. So I wouldn't be surprised, quite frankly.
I'm live now. Well, I have to remember to unmute it. I was motivated, to be honest, by another observation, which again, at the risk of skirting domestic politics, which I'm not trying to do, there are certain things that stick out that just make me curious. And one of them is, this is the first US president that I can recall in my lifetime that we weren't, as a nation, whether in the sort of prevalent dominant conversation or in sort of the alternative community, discussing the person's religious and possible quasi or para-religious viewpoints and attitudes. You remember Nancy Reagan and the spiritualism and stuff like that. There hasn't been a single president that we didn't go, are they involved secretly, and are they sympathetic to this group? Are they involved in this group? Are they getting their ideas from Rasputin? Where is it coming from? And the most obvious answer might be that Donald Trump has no religion. He's not religious. His whole thing is money, politics, and prostitutes or whatever. But at the same time, we're not the only ones asking the question. Like USCatholic.org, other institutions are analyzing, like, what if you get past the superficial or the substantive affiliation with religion, somebody is either Lutheran or they're Mormon or whatever, then what is the religion of Donald Trump? And they're asking it more in a metaphorical or philosophical way. What tenets of faith are there?
What exactly does he think?
Yeah,
well,
where does that come from? And
we haven't
omitted from why have we never had a conversation to ask, is it possible that a man could rise to that position of power with zero influence from any religious or philosophical metaphysical framework?
No, I don't think it is. But I would challenge the idea that there's never been a similar hysteria about an American president, because Abraham Lincoln had many of his philosophical and spiritualist views, which he was a practicing spiritualist, especially Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife.
I can't recall in my lifetime,
in modern history, yeah,
where there's a president that we never discussed his religion ever.
This sort of thing. Lincoln was an interesting case because the Southern partisans wrote about this aspect of his presidency shortly before the election and then shortly after the election. But Trump, my guess is that, again, we could be dealing with a case of kind of trickle-down spiritualist influence that percolates, across normal religious boundaries or normal denominational boundaries. Because if your intuition is correct, my guess is that you're dealing with memes that ultimately are traceable to theosophy, but detailing the connections of how they get passed from, let's say, the late 19th century spiritualists down to today, that would be a massive task, because you'd literally have to go person by person and show or document any of these actual connections. But I personally, I think the intuition here probably holds water, that there is probably something going on that nobody has caught the scent of, as you say.
I don't know if it's relevant, because I confess I haven't spent a lot of time with this particular character. I realize he's a household name, but Trump grew up going to Norman Vincent Peale's church and
Mhm.
listening to Norman
Mhm.
Vincent Peale.
Mhm.
I'm not aware of any that's a funnel for any particular other. It's positivism and the gospel of
Mhm.
prosperity, but I'm not
Mhm.
aware that it's linked to anything deeply occult or anything particularly different religiously.
Well, that I would aver again, even with Norman Vincent Peale or people like David Carnegie, that whole, as you say, gospel of positivism or positive thinking. There is, as far as I recall, in the Webb books, and it's been many years since I've actually looked at them, so I'm going on kind of a faulty memory here, or bad memory. But if I recall correctly, Daniel, there was a connection that was made in one of those two books between the late 19th century spiritualists with their theosophical influence and then the early 20th century uh, people like Dale Carnegie, Norman Vincent Peale, and so on, that this percolated again throughout many of those institutions. So again, I think just on the surface of it, my intuition is that your intuition has some teeth. It may be something worth some detailed investigation.
Well, beyond the scope of what I can pull off, but maybe some of the listeners have some insights into it.
Mhm.
I don't know a lot about the positive thinking movement. I think I've read How to Win Friends and Influence People and never read a book by Norman Vincent Peale. And while I have been through landmark education, the stuff that people associate with sort of the pop version of that, like Tony Robbins, I've never been to one of those seminars, or I can't get through a video. It's just too watered down for me. I'm just like, all right, I can't listen to any more of this. It's like,
Right.
but maybe there's something there. I have another topic for you that is on my mind, which has to do with a much colder rather than wetter region. I'll come back to the rain later, maybe. I brought the umbrella to the show, so that should give you a hint of what's what's on my mind. I'm still thinking about floating biscuits, but
Mhm.
for those of you in the South, biscuits. That's what I think of when I think of the South. So, and I gotta say that with fondness, the one thing I always crave when I go to the South, it's not barbecue, it's not beef. It's true, you can't get any good barbecue in New York. There's no matter what you say, you listen to a New Yorker go, "This is good barbecue." It's not good barbecue. It's not even barbecue. But when I go to the South, the one thing I want is biscuits and gravy. My grandmother used to make that stuff, and you can't find, I mean, they mess it up. They put eggs in it here or do something weird to it, or it's just white with no, drippings of grease. Man, so the South, biscuits, floating biscuits. And if you're in the path of Florence, get out of the way and get your biscuits moved too. But to a colder climb, I want to take us to Antarctica.
I
Because
knew it.
you knew it. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, I knew
Someplace
it.
where the weather is a little more consistent, except the melting. Pretty soon it'll be t-shirt weather. But
Mhm.
you have the fossil tracks up there.
Mhm.
Not fossil tracks, but you have the fossils / tracks, or you look at something and like, is that a fossil or is that tracks, or is it something else? And I looked at those same photos that we're seeing, and I couldn't help but have a couple of questions to bounce off you. So one is, couldn't it be that what we're looking at is the remnants of previous explorations that are either A, relatively modern, meaning Victorian era, because one of those things looks less like vertebra than a row of pup tents
Mhm.
to me,
Right. Mhm.
and frozen pup tents don't collapse, but relatively modern or even ancient, and two, perhaps expeditions that might be covert, not just overt, so there would be no
Bingo.
record of an expedition in that area. But we're not, in fact, looking at alien tire tracks or
No.
giant hoverbird fossils that don't exist anywhere else. But we're looking at something that is there and exposed precisely because in the larger geographical timeline, it's fairly recent.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you're onto something there too. I looked at those pictures, and the reason I posted them was because there's so much strangeness now going on in Antarctica, and those pictures, which some of our members tracked down for themselves and have been posting as comments. So they're definitely there. Those things are definitely there. But I had the same feeling looking at those, that, you know, there could be any number of explanations. And I personally like your idea that these may be remnants of some prior expeditions that were covert and secret in nature. We certainly do not know the full story of Operation High Jump. I'm absolutely convinced of that. I don't think anybody who's looked closely at that whole thing has ever come away with the idea that we're being told everything that happened. I think clearly that something happened during that expedition. What, I don't know. I'm certainly not on the Nazi UFO chased him out of there scenario. Then there was the whole German expedition in 1938 and 39. And again, we're not being told everything about that expedition. What little there is we're left with guesswork and explanations which ultimately fail in the end. So would the Norwegians have penetrated more deeply into Antarctica and found some of these things, or left expeditions? That's a possibility. Would the British have done so? There is something very interesting with respect to the British that I should mention in connection with your hypothesis. And that is that in Nexus magazine, and this was, I think, about 10 years ago, there was a 3-part serialization of a man who claimed to have been with the British SAS in Antarctica after World War II, conducting secret expeditions and actually having a secret fight, quite literally. And it's, I think, sufficiently grounded. I have a lot of questions about the story, but the basic element of the story is that the British had a secret expedition after World War II into the interior of Antarctica. So again, we may be looking at leftovers of that. I don't know. But something, I mean, let's face it, Daniel, you get Secretary of State John Kerry going down there during one of the most hotly contested elections in American history. You've got the Patriarch of Moscow. You've got Buzz Aldrin. I mean, the people going down there that have a connection to the continent is just kind of mind-boggling. So to me, this is another indicator that, yeah, maybe they're going down there to look at this stuff. Maybe the word is circulated privately, and everybody now wants to go there, including Turkey.
Introduce an old friend into our or a group of old friends. We know them well, into our show today, because it's been such a long time. And we do promise them in every show, but they don't always show up. In keeping with our wearing hats and all of that, they have much nicer hats. But I can't help but Google map the Antarctica and find that the first 2 names I see as being the closest 2 points that might be connected in some way. Like if I was going to go to Antarctica, where would I leave from? I wouldn't fly from New York, right? The first 2 names I see are Princess Elizabeth Station in Antarctica, and above it, nearest point on the map, Argentina.
Right.
And I can't help but think a row of pup tents and giant, tractor-like tread tracks out in the Arctic, and people in hiding that need to put a lot of men away somewhere in pup tents and keep them safe until they can fight back or come back.
Here it comes.
Got Nazis, ma'am? I'm sorry, they're all in Antarctica. So I just wonder, could there be any, is that just smoke and reefer, or is there some weirdness about Argentina and precisely these weird areas of Antarctica being in such relative close proximity?
Daniel, I doff my hat for the latest attempt to get me to commit to the idea that the Nazis had a secret base there.
I think you shouldn't doff your hat. I deserve a change of hat. I want to see the
Pickelhaube is what you
or
want to
the.
see.
I like that German officer's hat that you have. That's my favorite. One with the crisp. You know, you're gonna have to button your collar to wear it. But
the me and my hats. But no, the problem I have always had.
There, you could throw a paper airplane or a manned glider.
Yes, I know, but the problem I've always had with the whole Nazi Antarctica UFO thing is if you go back to Friedrich Zinzel that had this kind of neo-Nazi press up in Canada, and you go to the group that's in and around Vienna after the war and so on, they're putting out all of this stuff about the Nazi last battalion and the secret UFO base and so on and so forth in Antarctica. And my problem with all of that has been, and I've never denied, and I'll say it again, I've never denied that the German Navy may have had, probably did have, one of those little automated weather stations that they planted all over the Arctic and probably down in the Antarctic just to monitor the weather for their operations. They placed these things in Greenland. They placed a few even in northern Canada. They placed them on Spitsbergen Island off of northern Norway. So, they did have these little automated weather stations. But the idea to me of the Germans sustaining any base there during the logistical problems that they were having just to sustain their war effort at sea would have just absolutely, to my mind, been impossible for them to maintain a permanent base of any sort in Antarctica. At best, they may have had the ability to, supposedly there's all these underwater caves on the coast of Antarctica. Well, they may have converted a couple of those to a U-boat base, but it wouldn't have been anything major or very large, given the logistical problems that they would have had to supply it. My guess is that if we're going to look at those pictures and see remnants of an expedition that happened previously, my guess would be that this was probably something left over from one of those after war expeditions, maybe Operation High Jump, maybe the British. I doubt very much the Germans, possibly the Norwegians, prior to the war. But every indication that I've seen is that the Norwegians never explored very far inland when they staked their claim down there. So where I would put my bet on the possibility of something secret having gone on that may account for those things would be after the war, during either the British or the American presence there.
Well, so I just can't help but mention, even maybe unrelated, that the other jumping off point, if I were to sail my glider, my manned glider, sitting perfectly upright with my hat crisp, to Antarctica, would be South Africa. That would be the other place I would leave from.
Right.
And, the history of South Africa, it's like, I don't know, Nazis with, that shop at TJ Maxx or something. It's not but with the history of apartheid. I just can't help but notice that those are the two jumping off points and get a little bit woolly about it. I mean, where are you going to come from? Madagascar. I mean, that's even farther, but.
Well, South Africa was, in fact, the place that Buzz Aldrin flew from when he went down there. And I forget exactly where in South Africa it was, but he did go to South Africa. And that's where it was in South Africa that he made that very, very strange statement. He put it on Twitter that he's getting ready to go to the launch pad. And, you can take that several different ways. Number one, he's an astronaut and he's using astronaut language to say, I'm getting ready to board the plane that's going to take me to Antarctica. Or you can take it the other way, which is what most people took, was he was referring to Antarctica itself as the launch pad. So, but yeah, he did go to Antarctica from South Africa. The third major jumping off point is New Zealand. But yeah, you've got a very strange set of something going on down there. I don't know what the heck it is. My best,
it's a very cold Mena, Arkansas. There's a little triangle there.
Well, the problem with Antarctica, and this goes back to what I've said all along. The problem with what we're seeing in Antarctica now is all of the people associated with it. It's a very bizarre list. I mean, Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, Kirill III of Moscow, Secretary of State Kerry, Buzz Aldrin. I mean, just that list alone is bizarre. And then you add to it, Erdogan in Turkey now wants Turkey to be involved in Antarctica. King Juan Carlos, before he died, made a junket down to Antarctica. So my best guess, Daniel, given the pictures that we've seen now that have come out on Google that people have pointed to in that YouTube video that I put up, given that there appears to be some very strange structures of whatever sort we want to interpret, be they man-made, be they fossils, what have you. Given that there's so much down there, my initial hypothesis about all of this, that they found something and it's quietly making the rounds of the powers that be, that looks to me like it's being more strongly confirmed. But as to what the nature of this is, the only thing that we've had any clue is when Buzz Aldrin was down there, he got sick and he had to be evacuated. And supposedly, and this is very problematic, supposedly he tweeted that what they found down there is pure evil. Well, that tweet, since he supposedly did this, disappeared. And the other problem with it was shortly after it was taken off and taken down, there was chatter on the internet that tweet was not true, that he did not in fact say that. But nonetheless, he was evacuated for medical reasons, spent a couple of weeks in the hospital, and now he's saying strange things again. So, something's going on down there. My bet is still on, given the pictures that we've now seen, my bet is that they found something and people are going down to look at it and they're not talking about it because it upsets a narrative or it presents some sort of security risk. I don't know.
Well, it's not the black ooze because we'd see it in their eyes, as it was worm-like across their pupils. So I'm not sure Mulder was right about that.
No, I'm not sure about that either.
Yeah, anybody that goes comes back different, but not Buzz Aldrin different, but really different. But I think what I'm hearing you say is, and you heard it here first, folks, that the Antarctic houses a secret launch pad for covert space operations.
Well, don't laugh.
Putting nukes into space,
Don't laugh about that, Daniel, because it's very strange. You're laughing, I know, but
I'm laughing because for a lot of reasons. But
yeah, but
what do you think?
But the problem there is that Lockheed Martin has a heavy presence in Antarctica doing, God knows what. We're not told. Supposedly, from what has actually been said, supposedly they've got some sort of data operation down there. And I'm thinking, okay, why are we bringing a major defense contractor to Antarctica to manage data? Well, is it for satellites? It could be anything. But again, the problem there is yeah, you could launch anything from Antarctica, and there's only going to be a very, very narrow circle of people that would know about it, namely countries that have, spy satellites in polar orbits and so on and so forth. But even then, they have to be over the South Pole if you're going to launch things. So who knows? Maybe it is a launch pad like Buzz Aldrin said. I don't know.
Dr. Farrell likes to point to his head. It's a signal that the aliens are in there.
No, it's a signal that you didn't. It's a signal that you didn't unmute unmute your microphone.
That's the cover story. That's what he wants us to know.
Mm-hmm.
So, have you taken a trip to the Antarctic yet, Dr. Farrell? Because
no, and I have no desire to.
Finding mission down there. I just chatted you a link to a book by Michael Salla called Antarctica's Hidden History: Corporate Foundations of Secret Space Programs, where he's arguing that since 1955 and the Eisenhower administration, that there's been a whole host of corporations doing business down there that the shareholders don't know about, and they're doing it illegally, and that there are classified space programs of the U.S. and other nations down there. I don't know anything about this guy or the book, but
I do know about the guy. I have profound misgivings about him. Although I have not read this particular book, but I have read other things by him, and there is an egregious lack of footnotes in what I have read of him. But more importantly, he has been involved recently in an effort with people like Corey Goode and so on and so forth, and the whole blue chicken avian thing, that as far as I and some other people in the alternative media can tell, is basically a marketing op that was designed to take the steam out of the secret space program conferences that I was a part of a couple of years ago, because he's definitely in the ETs are here and they're taking over sort of scheme of things. He has also gone on record on one occasion that my friend Richard Dolan was at the last year's MUFON conference with Corey Goode and Michael Salla and a bunch of other people, Andrew Basiago. And if you're not familiar with their stories, don't bother because they're just wild. Salla made the comment that, Albert Speer was the Nazi armaments minister, and he did so in a context that suggested that Albert Speer was the Nazi armaments minister from prior to the beginning of World War II, which is totally incorrect. Albert Speer becomes the armaments minister in 1943 when he replaces Fritz Todt. So he jumbles his facts as far as I'm concerned, but he may be onto something. Like I said, Lockheed Martin has a presence there, and if Lockheed Martin is a major defense contractor and has a presence there, it could be lots of other corporations do too that we simply haven't heard about. I find Lockheed Martin's presence there to be extraordinarily suspicious.
About what you say about the footnotes and all of that, because his author bio lists him right up front as an internationally renowned, recognized scholar. And, for internationally recognized scholars, due respect, we should, when their book jackets say that.
Well, yeah, when their book jackets say that, this is the problem. This is the problem.
It helps, especially when they recognize each other, because
well, like I say, he plays to the UFO crowd, and this is my problem. He basically is, as far as I'm concerned, this is my opinion, he's basically fronting for the whole UFO disclosure narrative, and I'll just crawl right out onto the end of the twig here, Daniel. As you know, I've written a lot about Antarctica in my books over the years, and I am not one of those people defending the Nazis having secret UFO bases in Antarctica or any of this nonsense that you hear repeated without any argumentation or without any substantiation within the ufology community. And this has caused me some grief over the years. Richard Dolan has confronted them as well, and he's one of the, I would regard, much more serious ufology researchers out there. If you haven't read his 2-volume study, UFOs in the National Security State, I would urge you to do so, because he approaches things from a very academic point of view. But my problem with Salla as with so many of these people, is it appears to me that they're trying to push a meme and do so precisely in order to denigrate people like me that have tried as carefully as we can to offer a view of the idea of a secret space program that's not just founded on wishful thinking or hearsay, but are trying to connect dots of missing money and trying to connect technologies and the engineering papers and so on and so forth. And that's a thankless job. And people like Saleh come along and just basically muddy the waters. So I personally don't have much use for him, but I'll read the book, since you brought it up, because I was unaware that he had written this book.
Cusp, I didn't know that was the end of a sentence. It was like we're scrambling for the button. So, and I just want to also mention that I think it's called Port-au-Français, but it's near Antarctica.
Mm-hmm.
That it's the Wikipedia entry says it's home to a runway that was never built. I thought that's an interesting statement. And also a slaughterhouse, apparently, which is an odd place to put one.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I want to ask you now about antimatter propulsion.
Aha.
Because we just chat about stuff like that in this show. And I don't see, Dr. Farrell, what the big deal is about antimatter propulsion for this simple reason.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up with, we were robbed. I grew up being promised floating cloud cities, and although we're starting to see them, but China gets them first. But floating cloud cities, hover cars, instant transportation and telepathy. I was promised all of this stuff. I should have a flying car by now. And instead, I have Google Home, which is okay, but it's not as much as I'd counted on. But nonetheless,
mm-hmm.
What we see is, I think, is a trajectory where science fiction becomes the testing ground for science.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily intentionally, but the fact is that if man can conceive it, man will build it, or man will find a way to build it. And ultimately, what we're seeing now is faster and faster. When we think a thing ought to be able to be done, we start removing the friction and the barriers to do it. We start finding ways to achieve the technology. So now we're talking about warp drive. Mm-hmm. All it really took was for us to throw off that's stupid, that's nerd stuff, that's science fiction. The moment we got past the cultural inhibition and said just because it sounds very high tech doesn't mean it's a dumb idea and we shouldn't pursue it. And lo and behold, all that stuff is sitting there waiting for us to start unpacking. Mm-hmm. Not that we've achieved it, but that we're on the path. We got the laser sail propulsion thing, and cheesy as it might sound, to use a metaphor for Swiss cheese, the ultimate idea works. It may not be the best way to get a manned space out there, but it works. At least in the lab. So that we know of, it may work from Antarctica. So back to antimatter propulsion. It strikes me as just obvious and logical from a technology standpoint that, of course, we would be working on that for the last 50 years. And of course, we would have made strides by now. And of course, we might not want to tell anybody because the first person that had this, it would be a military secret. But we should be well on our way, if not having already sort of cracked the nut in theory and maybe in some light practical applications of antimatter propulsion. Mm-hmm. So my question is basically, what's the big deal? Can't we all assume that antimatter propulsion is probably there? And, eventually, once we have our first noticeable public demonstration of it, there's a need for the military application, either to get rid of an asteroid or launch a mission that we all have to know about or something. At that point, we'll start to see consumer versions and have our flying cars.
Well, the problem with antimatter propulsion, and I take it you're referring to the blog I did about it. The problem is both scientific and historical. So let me try to tackle the scientific problem first. Within physics, the problem that antimatter presents is the anisotropy problem. In other words, if antimatter existed in equal quantities to matter, we'd be seeing explosions going on all over the place. It's very difficult to create. We can do it. We have been creating antiparticles and antimatter for quite some time in particle accelerators. The problem is getting enough of it together and holding it together, containing it for a long enough period of time that you can do something with it, like propulsion. The other problem that it presents is that antimatter-matter reactions, those collisions, are total annihilation reactions. In other words, the energy that they produce is extremely high, and there's no after effect from it. There's no radioactive fallout such as there would be from an atom bomb or a hydrogen bomb and so on. So they're total annihilation reactions. So in other words, if you develop a technology that allows you to collect enough antimatter and then use it for propulsion purposes, that's a step along the technology tree to creating enough antimatter for the purposes of having a bomb. And theoretically, you could make that, depending on how much antimatter you collected, you could make that an extremely large and powerful bomb that, again, would have no radioactive fallout consequences or effects. So there is a military application here, and this goes to the second aspect of the problem, and that's the historical problem. In my books, I've pointed out, this was in Covert Wars and Clash of Civilizations. In that book, I pointed out that, as I did in Roswell and the Reich and some other books, that antimatter was being discussed as a potential propulsion means way back in the 1950s. In fact, it was kind of, in that period, it was kind of the propulsion method of choice that was being talked about, not just in popular journals like Popular Mechanics or Aviation Space Weekly and so on, but
breakthrough.
Pardon me?
It was the assumed breakthrough that we would make.
Right. It was the assumed breakthrough that we would make. And this was being talked about very openly up until about the mid-1950s. And this is something that Nick Cook, in his book, The Hunt for Zero Point, mentioned very prominently at the beginning of that book. And if people haven't read that book, again, I would urge them to do so, because, you know, this is a defense reporter for Jane's Defense Weekly. So, you know, it's a very prestigious, internationally recognized defense journal. And he pointed out in that book that all of the discussion of antimatter as a propulsion means died. I mean, it just quit around 1955, 1966, and you didn't hear any more about it. Which is why I think the fact now that we're hearing about it again indicates precisely what you've suggested, in that they are now to the point that they've made some practical proof of concept experiments along the way so that they can now start talking about it openly. And I suspect that the reason why they're talking about it openly is that, again, just like Lockheed Martin talking about its little fusion reactor that you can fit on the back of a semi truck, I suspect, again, that they're kind of, so to speak, softening up the ground, preparing public opinion for a whole host of technologies that may be lying in the wings. And I go back to something else that has been a constant meme in the last 10 years, and this is the idea of space mining, of mining asteroids, mining the moon, mining Mars, and so on and so forth. And the problem, as I've always pointed out, Daniel, and you've alluded to it in your own comments, is rocketry, chemical rockets, are simply not going to be sufficient to sustain any permanent human colonies, much less conduct commerce on the scale that they're suggesting. You have to have exotic means of propulsion, be it, you know, laser light sails to warp drive to antimatter propulsion, what have you. You have to have something on that order to make all that feasible. And I think probably they're just preparing the ground to get us ready for it.
Yeah, so the issue of antimatter propulsion is also the issue of sufficient antimatter fuel.
Right.
And I have a related question, which has to do with anti-gravity. And because that also, when I was growing up, that was just sort of the nickname for, why space things, science fiction space things could float. Let's turn on anti-gravity, activating
Right.
anti-gravity, engage anti-gravity.
Right.
I'm excited about antimatter propulsion, because then that means we'll have a Scotty. We'll be able to hear things like, "Give it her all she's got, Captain." I'll enjoy that if I'm alive. But I want to ask you about specifically anti-gravity and microgravity.
Mhm.
It strikes me that if I were trying to build an anti-gravity system, not that I'm qualified, but if to even engage in really the discussion much, but if I were investigating this, I would think, well, how can you make such a system operate?
Mhm.
And a lot of people think that when you go into space, there's no gravity. And so when you go into orbit, there's no gravity, et cetera, you float. And that's not really the case. There's
Right.
less gravity, but there's not no gravity. And so, astrophysicists say that everywhere in the universe there's gravity, there's at least microgravity. It's all out there in very small amounts.
Mhm.
And so my question is, could microgravity be a means, the presence of microgravity everywhere in the universe, provide us a means of propulsion through some sort of anti-gravity system?
My guess is yes, and I'll tell you why. It's a fascinating question, because there have been recent articles at phys.org, if you're familiar with that website. It just basically publishes physics papers and articles about experiments that people have done. And they have published in, I'd say, the last 2 to 3 years, articles on a number of experiments where scientists have been successful in creating enough antimatter particles. And it's important to understand what an antimatter particle is. Let's take a positron, which is basically an electron with a positive charge. So in other words, the way that a positron is described mathematically is it has all of the same descriptions as an electron. It has the same mass and so on, but it has a different spin, and therefore it has a different charge. So it's important to understand what antimatter is in scientific terms. Well, there have been physicists that, as a result of this, have been positing that there may be a case or a situation where you can produce negative mass. In other words, that you can produce a kind of particle that will react to gravity in the opposite manner. Instead of being pulled toward a mass, it will repel from a mass, and therefore you have a kind of an anti-gravity effect. Well, there have been experiments recently, again, I'm going on the basis of memory here, where some of these experiments have been performed and reported at phys.org, and they have been successful in producing some of these effects, but again, on a very, very small scale. It's not to the scale of, levitating a flying saucer or anything like that, but nonetheless, it's there, and the effects are demonstrable. The other thing that scientists have noted in terms of microgravity effects is this goes all the way back to Yevgeny Podkletnov in Russia and his experiments with superconductors. And this is mentioned once again in Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point, that Podkletnov noticed that objects around superconductors appeared to lose mass. And then he went on to perform a number of experiments where he would actually levitate things above a superconductor. And so again, it does appear that there is a possibility for some real anti-gravity effects. The problem is, of course, building a superconductor big enough and to be able to operate at less than near absolute zero temperatures. That's been the problem, and there have been some breakthroughs on that score as well in so-called room temperature superconducting. So again, we're getting little indicators, depending if you know on where to look in the physics literature. We're getting some indicators that they're doing these experiments. They feel confident enough about them to release the results publicly, which to me tells me that probably In the secret laboratories, they've gone much further. And I think that, again, we're just kind of being prepared for some massive technological changes.
The reason I was thinking about this is that so you have antimatter, which provides you anti-mass or negative mass, which provides you
That's the theory. That's the theory.
Which provides you anti-gravity. So antimatter to antimass to anti-gravity. And so if you were going to launch a space vehicle, you would need either an engine or the facility to do one of two things. You would either need to convert and maintain sufficient antimatter on board that would provide you a propulsion engine. And let's assume that this is not a stable condition, that you're going to take energy to maintain this situation. And that defeats the purpose. Because you need, how much energy do you need to maintain it? It may be more than the actual propulsive value you get out of the energy. But another option would be to transform surrounding antimatter at a micro level or transform surrounding matter or masses at a micro level into antimatter. So literally you would have a ship that moves by destroying matter around you. Dr. Farrell is whining, ladies and gentlemen. This is
that's the pooch.
He's hungry. No, I'm kidding. But
I think she's wanting me to take her out. But go finish your thought, and then I'll take her out.
So, so this would be literally almost like you could call it a planet-eating ship, but it would be a ship that would require the elimination of other, or the transformation of other matter around it in order to propel itself. And again, you would still need energy to create that function, unless you had discovered a method that only requires, say, kinetic energy or energy that can be reproduced at very low cost. Without a lot of resources. So I realized that anti-gravity is an effect and antimatter is theoretically a thing. And so the presence of anti-gravity everywhere in the universe does not suggest you can convert anti-gravity into anything, because that anti-gravity is present probably because of the large masses. But if it were not, if it were present, if even the tiniest mass in the universe exerted a tiny amount of gravity, then you could potentially eat up space rocks and asteroids and other small things. And
if you had a means to convert it, yes.
That's right. And all the fuel that was out there, if you could simply create an efficiency where the power necessary to drive the digestion system were less than the power gained by gobbling up and digesting matter, then all the fuel that you would ever want to propel your spaceship would be in space waiting for you. You just have to feel that you had the right to gobble it up and destroy it. And so now you go around by gobbling up and eating space stuff.
Well, that's true.
Like a whale eating krill.
Yeah, it's true insofar as it goes, but there's two problems that science has had in this regard. And one I've already mentioned, and that's the matter-antimatter anisotropy problem. That there is a lopsided universe, so to speak. And the problem comes out of what physicists and quantum mechanics have called symmetry breaking. Because if you look at the standard model of quantum mechanics, for every particle, there's an antiparticle. Okay, so that means, according to the standard model, if you take that as your prediction, as the basis of your predictions, let's take the recent supposed discovery of the Higgs boson, which is the particle that was predicted by the physicist Higgs that would provide mass to any physical system. It's a subatomic particle. Well, on the standard model of symmetry breaking, this would imply, theoretically, the existence of an anti-Higgs boson that provides negative mass. And like I said, that there have been some papers and experiments recently that seem to demonstrate that this is a real phenomenon at the subparticulate level. The problem is that in trying to produce antimatter particles, it takes an enormous amount of energy to do so. And then once you produce them, most of the times they annihilate rather quickly. So the other problem is collecting enough of the stuff for containment. And that, again, from everything that I know, suggests that the energy requirements are abnormally high. So let's take your supposition and work with it here. If they are now talking openly about antimatter propulsion, that means that they have either solved the containment and production problem, or they are sufficiently confident that they're going to do so soon. And if that's the case, then just very bluntly, folks, if that is the case, everything we know about our world, including its system of finance, is about to change, and change in a way that no one, I'm quite confident, no one can predict. The reason why is with a financial system based on supposedly non-renewable resources like petroleum, all of a sudden you've got a system of either fusion or antimatter production. You now have an open energy systems, and that's going to wreak havoc on the financial system, which has been based on a closed energy system. So I suspect, Daniel, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, I suspect that the principal reason that we have not seen the flying cars that you and I were told about, in our weekly readers as kids, is precisely the financial problem. How do you transition a financial system from one thing to something so radically different without creating massive chaos? And I say that as a principal reason for the cloaking of this technology for so long, because if you look at some of the Bilderberg meeting agendas going all the way back to, let's say, the middle of President Reagan's 2 terms in office, if you go back and look at the agendas on the Bilderberg meetings over and over from that point up through, I'd say, the mid 1990s, even recently, I think there was a Bilderberg meeting where they were discussing the problems of fusion and the problems that it could present if it becomes an operative technology to the world financial system. So I suspect that, again, the primary reason that these technologies haven't been more openly released is they're trying to figure out a way to manage the transition with a minimum amount of financial upheaval in the world. I really do suspect that that's one of the principal reasons here.
I believe you need to take your dog out for a second, right?
Yeah, let me take the pooch out. Do you have to go outside, Shiloh? Do you want to go outside? She says yes. So let me be right. Oh, geez. Let me be right back.
So, ladies and gentlemen, he's going to take his dog for a walk.
Okay, sorry about that. We went out earlier and she did all of her business, but that was a roll in the grass false alarm.
Well, you'll notice, folks, that only one of them came back. So the other dog is on her way to Argentina or whatever, I suppose.
No, she's right here. She's laying on the bed.
Well, so where were we? We were talking about antimatter.
Antimatter.
So I have a related question,
Mhm.
and this is about. It's not going to pick up the automatic switch again. Once we switch manually, we have to switch manually. So I'll do that. We've been seeing reports. I've seen them on the Giza website about a floating city over China, and a ghostly city witnessed in China. You know what I mean, right?
I've seen that. I didn't blog about it. It was somebody I think that commented about it.
Okay. So so there are all these reports about a ghostly city, a flat thing. But what you did blog about was a couple of things. One is a flat object found upon the moon, very thin, a sheet of something, and another
Mars.
on Mars. Sorry, and the other is a feed that was cut off when what appeared to be a spacecraft approached the space station. You know what I'm talking about? Like, and it looked for all the world like a very flat object, you know? And so I got to thinking about this, and I got to thinking, well, so could there be such a thing? Could there be, we have aerial gun platforms. I mean, so could there be larger platforms that could attain orbit, could go up into space? And could some of the spacecraft we see actually be terrestrial manned units? And I got to thinking about missing flights, like the missing Malaysian airliner.
Yes.
And I got to asking myself, well, that's ridiculous, because an airliner can't be taken into orbit. It's, for one thing, wings don't work because there's no air. And for another thing, it just doesn't have the fuel. You need a rocket to get up there. But another thing that is possible is something we saw in the 80s, which is you piggyback one vehicle on top of another vehicle. And now the vehicle with the sufficient propulsion to attain orbit can certainly do that. Now, would a flight be able to survive, a commercial airliner be able to survive orbit without reinforcement, without special preparation, without alterations to the vehicle? Probably not. It might break up or, disintegrate, etc. But it struck me that if you got floating cities, you need floating people. You need people up there. And if you got a city, you need more people than just a volunteer crew of 10 or 20 astronauts. You need enough diversity that you have enough stuff to make a city go, etc. So let's just assume that the story wasn't crazy for a minute, and that there were such a thing as a floating city, and orbital or suborbital or not, we already do have planes that'll do suborbital flight, by the way. But that it makes it up in far enough that Chinese people in a certain province could witness this ghostly floating city. Now you got a place where you'd want to be able to go back and forth and land aircraft. We need a mechanism for doing this. So combine, it's all like a prepackaged set of speculations, but combined with NASA cutting live feeds on an object that appears to be flat. The Chinese supposedly witnessing, some Chinese supposedly witnessing a floating city, and the still missing flights that we don't know what to do with. Do you think there's anything to this possibility that we could actually be looking at the initial evacuations of the planet into test environments?
Oh, wow. I didn't expect that curveball. The assumption is if that's the case, that we have already the technology to put something like that up there and sustain it. You've mentioned the...
Well, Dr. Farrell, it wouldn't take more technology than to put a space station up there, would it?
Yeah, it would. If you're going to have a whole city, you'd have to have a much more massive infrastructure than just the International Space Station, which already has a pretty sufficiently large infrastructure just to sustain it. Um, but again, uh, that's the public platforms that we all know about, rockets and so on and so forth. A whole city is presupposing massive technological leaps that have been kept secret. However, that said, you mentioned the suborbital craft that can get up there and back. Well, these things, in my mind, probably exist. There are all sorts of videos that you can find on YouTube of supposedly the Aurora spacecraft, the successor to the Blackbird, which supposedly uses a ramjet type of propulsion. And indeed, when you look at these videos, you do see these odd contrails of a string of exhaust, but then large balls or puffs that would definitely be a signature of a kind of a ramjet that's being used in high altitude flight. That the idea of using that kind of ramjet rocket type of combinational technology actually does go back to World War II and to some Nazi ideas that were put out by a fellow by the name of Edward Sanger, Sanger, that appear to be kind of the conceptual basis behind some of the thinking that people speculate go into Aurora. Then there's another problem that is, to me, highly suggestive that the lift capability of putting humans into orbit is probably far beyond what we've been told. And this goes back to the NASA hacker Gary McKinnon in the United Kingdom, who claimed to have hacked into the NASA database and uncovered the names of ships and captains and crew members of these ships that were supposedly in orbit, part of a secret space fleet, so to speak. And you know the story. The United States wanted to extradite him from the United Kingdom and stand trial for hacking into American sensitive databases in the Department of Defense. The United Kingdom refused to extradite. End of story. Well, the problem is that in addition to the McKinnon hack, people started going to investigate his claims. And one of the things they discovered was in Ronald Reagan's memoirs. Reagan talked about the fact that when he was briefed on America's space launch capability when he became president, he was told that the United States had the ability to launch 300 people into orbit. And if you look at the then existent space shuttle platform, that's a number that's far in excess of the space shuttle launch capacity, which I think at the time was about 30 to 40 people if you were to use all of the shuttles and launch them, one right after the other. So the idea that there may have been 300 people either points to a deliberate attempt to disinform, or it points to an existing reality. My suspicion is probably the latter. So I don't rule out maybe not a city, but a village.
Well, Dr. Farrell, I stand by the need to bring an umbrella, because if there's a floating city up there, they're peeing downhill. And frankly, when they pass overhead and have to make a deposit, I don't want to be under that stuff. But if I am, I'm going to carry an umbrella. Yeah, I thought that too. I thought, how do you know whether somebody says they see a floating city, even if there was something like that, if they would know the difference from a small village between a city and just a slightly bigger village. But I think what the description is that it has the functioning parts of what looks like, a more technological and metropolitan installation.
Well, I mean, if you look at the speculations that have been out there about the Aurora suborbital launch plane, most of the speculations concerning that aircraft boil down to one very basic thing, and that is that this is a much larger aircraft than the SR-71 Blackbird. We don't know anything about it. My suspicion is that the largeness is due to the propulsion plant in it rather than what it's trying to lift up there. But that said, it is nevertheless, in all the speculations I've seen about it, a fairly large aircraft that could be used, I would think, to not only overfly Russia or China and spy on them, but also to take cargo and or crew up into space, and we would know nothing about it. So it could be that you're looking at a technology that's being used precisely to sustain some secret sort of manned presence in outer space. The Chinese floating city thing, from what I remember of that story, people were pointing out that there were some atmospheric problems, that what they were seeing may have been some sort of unusual reflection of something on the ground, that for whatever anomaly was being projected up there. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not hinging it on that particular story per se, but it just provides interesting fodder for analyzing the possibility that this is plausible to people precisely because in the back of our minds, we suspect that there's more capability in our space program than we've let on.
Right.
Because there would have been a time we would have all just said that's balderdash. There's no way, we can't even hit the moon. And now we all kind of suspect there's more to our, we know there has to be more to our space program that's covert than overt.
Well, look at what Elon Musk has just came out with in his plans to build this big space liner around the moon. I mean, if you look at the plans for this thing, Daniel, it's ginormous, to use the word that Art Bell popularized, capable of taking 150 people on this thing. And he's serious about it. And this is just conventional rocketry that he's talking about here. So, if that's possible, under current conditions of rocket technology development, then yeah, it's possible to have something that is a suborbital plane that can sustain a much larger manned presence up there. So anything's possible. The problem that you've also raised is, could this be why NASA cut the live feeds from the space station? Well, the way I'm thinking, Daniel, is if there is such a platform up there, it's probably going to be much further out in orbit than even high orbit satellites. And in other words, it's probably going to be parked somewhere between here and the moon, quite literally. And that would make it not invisible to detection, but it would make it much more difficult to detect if there is any such thing like that up there.
Speaking of Art Bell, he just died in April.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
There were a lot of medications in his system, but of course, for a person that age, it's probably normal. The thing I wanted to mention is also that if we're in our Art Bell mode, you could conclude. I mean, Snopes has already dismissed the floating city story as not true, but on rather the absence of evidence than on the basis of definitive proof of falsehood, and that's not quite the same thing, as you know.
Right.
So, one thing that comes to mind is, yes, a reflection of something on the ground. Another that comes to mind is a straight up hoax. The story is manufactured. It's so easy to manufacture a story these days and claim hundreds of people saw it when you and your friend made it up in your backyard and you got one or two people to agree they saw something. Pretty easy to do. But the other thing is, it made me think of the Philadelphia experiment. and the possibility that what's being seen is neither something that's floating up in the sky per se, nor a reflection of something that's on the ground, but is more of a reflection of something that's elsewhere.
Right.
Just an obvious thought if we're going to talk about things that go bump in the night.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you on a slightly different note about American education, and a question that's very similar to what I was asking about anti-gravity, which is, isn't it a foregone conclusion? Why don't we all just assume that anti-gravity is either in the works or in the later stages of development, rather than we're just wondering if we could do something like that? Like we're farther along, it would seem obvious, right, to people that just keep going with the beat of how technology progresses, that, yeah, of course we're working on that. And next we'll have telepathy, which we probably already have made strides in, and next we'll have transportation of matter, which we've already made strides in, and so on and so on. We keep duplicating Star Trek. So in the same way with public education, I don't know why in the alternative community, but especially at Giza in particular, a certain assumption doesn't prevail. So I hear a lot of parents complaining about what's happening in education. Unfortunately, I don't care about most of the complaints, not just because I don't have kids, but because most of them seem to hinge on a particular, in order to care about the things they're bringing up, they seem to be the most superficial things that hinge on a particular religious framework that I don't share. So if somebody says the dresses are too short, or they shouldn't talk about condoms in school, or they should pray, or they shouldn't mention evolution, I have no interest in that topic, and I don't think those are obvious things.
Right.
But when somebody talks about, and I also don't think that it's necessarily harmful, though I may think it's stupid, I don't think it's necessarily harmful to create safe spaces and all of that. I think when it gets out of control is when you get kind of a tyrannical fascism that doesn't allow you to express opinions because the opinions might be considered violence, or it doesn't allow you to explore certain things because exploring those things would make it so that not everybody has achieved everything equally or whatever. That gets a little bad. But go beyond that and go to what I think bothers you the most, or what I interpret in your posts about American education, which you always misspell. And I always found that at first you got to learn how to spell it, Dr. Farrell, then you can criticize it. But in your posts about American education, you seem to be most concerned about the complete absence of quality rather than the presence of a safe space or a speech code that says you can't say certain word, you can't say the word immigrant, you have to say, visitor or something like that. You seem more focused on what's not there. What's not there is the reading of original sources. What's not there is any or very much integrity to producing original work and original thought, and then attributing work that is not yours properly. Things like that. So that's where you and I fall in line. I agree with you. But in the same way, so here's my question. In the same way that we consider anti-gravity and some of these other things to be just a given, of course it's going to go that way. Let's just treat it like it's not that amazing. Public education is going, or is already all the way down the toilet, depending on how you look at it. It's going that way. So why doesn't the alternative community, instead of just complaining endlessly about what's wrong with public education, for goodness sake, abandon it and decide public education shot. You're never going to switch it. You're never going to change it. Your solution is not to go to board meetings and complain from within that we need to bring back prayer, or demand that they bring back study of original sources. Hell, the teachers didn't study them either. They don't know how to bring them back. It's over. So even if the administrators told the teachers, the administrators have worse educations than the teachers, which is saying a lot. And so when you go to it, there's nobody left in the system that knows how to fix
how to do it. Right.
In a way, it's already an idiocracy. So for God's sake, pull your kid out of there.
Yeah.
Start doing something. Don't homeschool as a way of sitting home and watching Oprah on the sofa, but or just reading the King James Bible and then you're done. Everything you need is in this big book. But I've seen that stuff. That's what I'm saying.
I don't like it any more than you do.
Yeah, you don't need to brush your teeth. First, fluoride's a conspiracy, and second, everything you need is the book, and there's no toothbrush in the book. I've seen some egregious crap. But why, Dr. Farrell, don't you and everybody else just ultimately say, we're done with this. Screw public education.
Well, as a matter of fact,
funded, and even at the, I'll finish with this, even at the post-secondary level, if it receives student loan dollars, meaning that the federal government has their hands in what's going to go on and what can't go on, they're vested interest in dumbing it down. If it does that, we're just going to pull out and automatically write it off as an option.
Right. Well, as a matter of fact, I've been saying more or less the same thing for quite some time. I do believe I'm of the John Taylor Gatto school here. I believe the system is so shot that there's no fixing it. I do believe that. And I have told people, in fact, I get occasionally, Daniel, emails from members here or people that read the website. You know, I'm thinking about putting my kids in school. Where do, you know, going off to college, where do I send them? And I've been very blunt with them. I've told them, don't send them to any American university. By and large, with but one or two exceptions, there's no place if I had kids, I would send my kids to. I've told them almost universally to, if they have the money, to consider sending their kids overseas to get a university education, and a real university education. I've also been adamant on my stance that, you know, the whole process of teacher certification is part of a central part of the problem with American education, particularly in the public school sector. This idea that you have to be licensed in a special thing called education rather than show competence in the discipline that you're supposed to teach, be it English or biology or what have you. Yeah, my complaint is exactly that there's a total lack of academic standards anymore, and this is even reflected in the so-called style manuals that are being pushed in the American Academy right now, the AP manual or the MLA manual of style. I'm old school, you know. If I have a complaint about those manuals, style manuals, is that they're too loosey-goosey. They don't specify precise pages. They clutter up the main text with parenthetical references and so on, where the good old-fashioned footnote puts it at the bottom of the page. You know, just little picky stuff like this, but it all adds up. And I'm in total agreement that for the most part, what we're dealing with is a system that is so completely shot that, yeah, I wouldn't want to be a part of it. I have the equal concern about people that homeschool and then basically use this as a pretext to indoctrinate their kids with claptrap that's more coming out of fundamentalism than it's coming out of any real desire to educate from primary sources. So, you know, I've also told people that if you must send your kids to an American college, then investigate those colleges in this country that are still left that emphasize primary source education, like St. John's College or Hillsdale or places like that literally drill down into those things and do so rather successfully. But, you know, that's a handful. We're talking about a handful in a system that's gone absolutely bonkers nuts. You know, I've told the story and I'll tell it again. I saw the rot setting in back when I started to do my doctorate, and I finally concluded that I'm going to have to go overseas in order for me to do what I wanted to do it the way I wanted to do it. So that's the reason I ended up at Oxford studying with Callistus Ware, because I knew that at least there at that time, I can't speak for now, but at least at that time, I would be able to do what I wanted to do without suffering through all the claptrap. And that was in the middle 1980s. I went over there in 1984 for my interview, started in 85 and finished in 87. So it was bad then, and I can't even imagine what it would be like now in a postgraduate program in this country. So, you know, it's not that I didn't follow my own medicine, so to speak.
I heard Bard College used to be good, but you heard it here, folks. Dr. Farrell is really against the Oxford comma, which is oppressing us with it's
no, I'm not.
Patra, it's male dominated assertions, and so the Oxford comma is stricken from the blog. You can't use it on Giza. That's how those of you that complain your comments are mysteriously disappearing.
It's not the
You used
Oxford
an Oxford comma, and
It
we
is not the Oxford comma.
So, but I think you're right. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Basic principle of science. So you can't get back there from here with current education. There's no way to make it recover.
Right.
And what I often run into is also the myth of the small public school. But I've seen those schools. People are like, our school is out in the middle of nowhere and it has a teacher size of one teacher for every 5 students. And I'm like, they're coloring in the 5th grade. You know, their way of studying history is to bring home a picture of a historical figure and color them. And the correct answer is that the pants should be the color of pants. And the hair should be roughly.
I've seen similar things in the homeschooling movement, and again, I'm equally as skeptical of that. I don't have any problem if people want to homeschool, but by golly, if you want to homeschool, then make it in the primary sources. There's no reason that we can have people that are early teenagers not reading Plato or not reading Aristotle. For crying out loud, this is what used to be done in schools. You know, you got that kind of education very early on. And now in this system, everybody is treated like, they're 3-year-olds, and they're treated that way all the way through high school. And then they arrive in college, and all of a sudden, they're in a different ball game altogether. So it's a completely dysfunctional system. I accuse me of what you will, but I don't think the system is fixable at this juncture. No amount of money is going to fix it. And as you've pointed out, something very, very important is that for the most part, we're dealing with a teaching profession now that is no longer even exposed. It does not even know what that high academic tradition really is or was, because they haven't had it. So expecting a reform to come out of the profession itself, with 1 or 2 exceptions, is it's just not going to work.
I'm glad you've created a safe space for us to talk about this, Dr. Because the violence of your Oxford commas has made it hard for me. But I do have a degree in education, a graduate degree, as you know, and I use it in my profession to, not the degree, but what I learned in the degree. Although I've learned, it was just a launching pad. That's all it ever gave me, was a starting place to start acquiring knowledge. But I use it because one of my practice areas professionally as a consultant is to design and build education programs for clients, nonprofits. And so I'll build a whole school or a graduate program, meaning start to finish. What is the curriculum? How does it work? How do we deliver these programs, et cetera? Is it a mix of digital and in-person? What are we doing? And very often, one of the things we do is we employ practice area leaders who have a practice area, a subject matter expert, if you will. And we don't expect that they know necessarily how to keep the audience enthralled or how to give a proper assessment or something like that. And so we have some protocols and some standards that allow us to bring in a wider variety of people who don't have to have a degree in education, because we can collaborate on that side of things. And then I have my practice areas, things that I can teach in which I am the subject matter expert, because then I can implement as well as just plan somebody else's implementation. But my experience is that there are really 3 things that you can get out of public education or institutional education, I would say. I would aver that the danger of a teenager, an adolescent, reading Plato, which I certainly did, and then you read Nietzsche, and then you read Derrida, and you can really get screwed around really fast, because teenagers, adolescents have a propensity to read something and then immediately that's their thing, just like they listen to some band and that's the greatest band in the world and I'm always going to listen to this way. You can really get warped quickly, and then your life is an upheaval. The advantage that traditional education offers is it offers a community to bat ideas around, and then a teacher to say, all right, so you're convinced that we should have Plato's Republic, the intelligentsia should govern. what about X? And throws a wrench in that. And through that process, you could call it a Socratic process of testing ideas and question and answer. You get something you don't get out of the typical homeschool or read it alone in the library. It's just not knocking that.
Bingo.
So when you're in that environment, I find that there are really three directions. We tend to break it into two. One is vocational and the other's academic. I don't think that's right. One is trade or vocation. So if you're going to go to school to get a job, you're not going to get a decent liberal arts education, even at a decent liberal arts college, in my experience. I think that if you're going to get a degree in criminal justice so that you can be a guard at a prison or whatever you're going to be, don't expect to get the best English literature classes and a wide array of deep study of medieval philosophy so you can gather how ideas have come to be. The other reason to go is academics, for people that are going to stay in school all their lives. And I've met those people, and frankly, they don't speak English. They speak footnote, and that's all they do. You know, well, Winger is, I hear what you're saying. Winger says that, but then Jodeman says that Winger's wrong on page 45 of his book. And I'm like, I don't know who Winger is and Jodeman is, but it sounds like an esoteric discussion in the ivory tower between two guys who couldn't get a degree outside of political science. Bores the crap out of me, Dr. Farrell. I'm not bored with footnotes, but that's not how you talk around a bottle of beer. And then the third option is somewhere in between. It's a liberal arts education where you're going to pursue either a mix of academic areas at the younger age because you just want to know stuff, or the pursuit later on of a specific discipline which you pick out of that and which could stay multidisciplinary. And that's what I would call the kind of education that you used to provide. You didn't insist on footnotes so that we could go around and constantly cite things in our normal conversation and couldn't talk to ordinary people. But you insisted on footnotes because you wanted us to be able to defend our ideas and differentiate between our ideas and someone else's, precisely so we didn't drink the adolescent Kool-Aid and get confused and have somebody just decide what our thinking was. So now I'm walking around spouting Derrida, but I don't attribute it. And also because you wanted to force us to think of to have our own ideas and be able to enter those into the arena, if you will, of discourse and debate. So those three directions, trade and vocation, or academics, pure academics, or liberal arts, I think are what parents kind of have to, with their children, decide or lay out as, what do you want to do? Or do you want to do none of this? Because these days you can start a business without a degree. No one's going to ask you for your diploma, 6 months after you're in business.
Well, you raised an important point, because the problem with our education system, as far as I can tell now, is that we're trying to do all three things all at once in every institution. So we've now got universities giving out degrees that are basically licenses for particular professions, criminal justice, what have you. And that has become more or less the focus of education in this country. You get an education to get a job. Well, that's true in most cases, but then why do we have that being provided by places like Harvard or Stanford or so on and so forth, which are academic and professional institutions, law and medicine and so on. So I think again, you're onto something that we're trying to do too much with the system, and as a result, the system is breaking down because it can't do all of those things at the same time. If you want to learn a trade, how to fix cars or in a body shop or things like that, go to a trade school and learn it. If you want to be a professional musician, go to a conservatory and so on and so forth. So I think, I'm in agreement with you. I think we're just trying to do too much. And as a result of doing too much, we're also confusing in people's minds, what is this institution for? Most people have it in their mind that they get an education to get a job, and yet they're going to these institutions where they're learning, Derrida, things like that, as you've mentioned, which are going to do them absolutely no good. So we've got to get out of this mentality of colleges, I think, as licensing bureaus for particular kinds of jobs. That's my whole beef with teacher certification and education, is that really you're just doing licensure, and you're not really focused on what the license is supposed to be about. And that's my fundamental problem with it. I don't deny the importance of those sorts of things for preschool and for, young children and things like that, because you do have to know a certain amount of psychology to be able to function. But by the time you get to college, high school level, I think, those things are more inutile than they have any utility.
Well, certainly, I see a younger generation who's figured out the gig economy, that you can tell your boss to go to hell and probably go work for 4 times the pay by just doing whatever skill you've learned for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're definitely in an era of self-employment. And yet, at just before the point where they might do that, I see students saddling themselves with enormous college debt by going to school under an outdated or obsolete framework where they might have a job for 40 years straight.
Right. To me, it's hideous, Daniel. You look at the amount of student loan debt now that students are piling up, and to me, it's just, I'll just be blunt about it. It's unethical, because the expectations that have been created by the system and what it's able to deliver now are two very, very different things. And again, I go back to what you said earlier. If it's reached this point, then why, if you have children, would you want to ensnare your children to that kind of debt slavery for the rest of their lives, unless they're going to be lawyers or doctors or something like that, where they can possibly recoup more money and pay off that debt? But for crying out loud, $100,000 to get a degree in social justice or Reconstructionism or Jacques Derrida, this makes no sense to me. It's not a workable system. It's not a sustainable system at all.
Well, or even criminal justice. I think that's the degree you go when you're out of options. But that's like getting a degree in food preparation. But no offense to people that have the degree, but you got to admit it wasn't as challenging as studying medieval philosophy. And the deal is that 90% of those degrees, it's not that you learn how to do the work, that therefore you can go do the work and that's why you get a job. It's an illogical system. What you learn is a set of vocabulary where you're saying the same things with the same meanings that we have, but you're using a specialized set of terminology. 90% of every specialized degree I ever saw at an undergraduate college was a job-based degree, was just learning a different word. I swear to you, if a nurse was studying soap and a criminal justice major was studying soap and a food preparation major was studying soap, they would all have a different name for it, but all still just be soap. And you can't pass the test and get the degree until you learn that. And then you got to wave that around to get the job, which doesn't mean you're competent at it. So,
well, it's a very Gnostic trend in the modern academy that reality is being defined by the language that's used. And the more specialized the language, then you create a specialized discipline to talk about the same thing. So this is another, I recall many times that we've had discussions about that years ago, the fragmentation of disciplines that's going on, each with their own specialized vocabulary, makes interdisciplinary communication all but impossible. And that really is what a liberal arts education was supposed to be about, to allow you to understand things. And that's all but gone.
Yeah, the difference between the specialized vocabulary and a common metaphor like the Sword of Damocles or Pyrrhic victory, those metaphors drawn from an agreed canon of literature created a civilization that wasn't as polarized as it is now. But now we create our own language, we create our own facts.
Yeah, right. And again, it goes back to what you said before. I don't think that the current system is fixable. The alternative community has not, to my knowledge, provided any other answer other than homeschooling. And I don't have one either, other than to say, well, maybe it's time to build out a new system. But that takes a lot of work, that takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and most people just don't have that to spare.
Well, I mean, even if you fight for 2.5 years and you manage to
Right.
bring back a prayer at lunchtime and ban Huck Finn, did you really create a sound and proper educational system, or did you have
No, not really.
did you have a symbolic or, God forbid, Pyrrhic victory where it was superficial at best? So I'm not sure that the fight that's being fought is achieves the goals that the people saying they're fighting for are reaching out to fight.
No, it doesn't.
It just gives you a different crappy education.
Right. Exactly.
A crappy education with God in it.
Yeah, and the problem is, as you say, it's really kind of just mirroring the problem rather than trying to solve it. And as I said, the solution seems to be, well, we've got to build out a new system, but no one has the time, energy, money, or other things to be able to do that, and that also is the problem.
Well, so I always intended to homeschool, Dr. Farrell. When I never had children by choice, because I changed what I wanted to do with my life. But early on, I thought it was a foregone conclusion. You grow up, you have kids. And so I was definitely intended on homeschooling, and I had amassed 50,000 books in my own library. You remember, you could walk in my apartment.
Sure, yeah, I do.
You bled into several other rooms. And I did my whole undergraduate education from books off the shelf, taking the lower letter grade because the teacher would be mad that the book wasn't in the library.
Right.
Used outside sources.
Horror! Perish the thought, Daniel.
Perish the thought. And I took that with stride through that guy. But I had always intended that you still need a network. You still need other people to sharpen your ideas off of. You still need the kinds of discussions that we would often have over pitchers of beer and late into the night, wrestling with philosophical issues.
Well, this is another problem that you bring up here, and it's worth noting this about some current trends in modern education, particularly the Common Core business. Everything is going to be standardized, adaptive, computerized tests, and the teacher is kind of reduced to a proctor. And I'm thinking, okay, if that's the case, what's the point of having the teacher and having the classroom? The teacher in the classroom is precisely for that exchange, that discussion of ideas that you're talking about, and they're even trying to eliminate that. So,
well, you need it, but you need the other students as well, because you need people wrestling with the same idea, and it can't be one of these safe environments where so you're in so I'm in a logic class, and I make the mistake. We're paired up in groups of 3 to 4, small groups, and we need to argue our points, and somebody argues their point, and our job is to locate the logical fallacies, and I point out that somebody's argument's fallacious, and I get called out in the hall and told that I made a violent statement. And I'm like, this is logic. It's like saying that if you got the wrong answer in math and somebody points out that's not the answer, they've committed an act of violence against you. This is the point of the class. Whereas in your class, somebody threw a freaking rock at me. And I was arguing for a solipsistic point of view where I'm the only one exists and everybody else is an effect of my perception. Somebody hits me a rock, throws a rock, hits me in the chest. And I said, what'd you do that for? And he goes, there's proof that your argument's fallacious. If I'm just a figment of you, apparently, and so today we would all get booted out of the academy, even if we threw a marshmallow. You need that circulation. And so what I had always planned to do was to build a network. That's what the alternative to any society is, to build your own society, build your own network. I don't mean compound where you're out in rural Utah marrying 13-year-olds, but I'm talking about one in which parents who are subject matter experts in a certain area, engineering, welding, whatever the heck they are, exchange skills with parents that aren't, and you essentially create your own interdisciplinary curriculum. You need that, and you need access to the other students. That's how I was going to do it. And you create your own libraries. For one other point I want to make, which is that parents that don't read books have nothing to say to me about education, because you're complaining about what your kids are reading, but you don't read. So it just shows that you don't really care. It doesn't really matter to you. And it turns out statistically, only 48% of Americans read books. The other 52% don't own them, don't use them, don't want them. And I'm thinking, what does that 52% have to say about anything related to education. You don't read.
Right.
I mean, that's like the most basic thing.
Well, this is a common complaint. We have a number of members on our website here that are teachers, or who have gone and obtained, a baccalaureate and master's, graduate degrees or whatever, and almost universally, Daniel, from these people, I hear exactly what you're saying. That we're also dealing now with a culture that just does not like to read. It prefers everything in sound bites and so on and so forth. And again, you're spot on. If you are a parent and you don't have any books in your house or enjoy the pleasure of reading, then why complain? How are you going to homeschool your children if you're no better informed than they are? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, now it just becomes a cover for things to avoid in education rather than things to go toward. It's not about education. Right. It's about filtering out content you don't like or agree with.
Right.
I think what a lot of people, there are people that don't read, who are also financially affluent, who aren't ignorant, but who, for them, they're teaching their kids that it's all a gimmick to get through it, and they don't want their kids to go through anything tough or difficult.
Right.
But that's showing them sort of a way around the system. So let's not read Moby Dick. Let's watch the movie and get the clip notes and or read the cartoon version. All you got to do to pass and here's another Cliff Notes that tells you the stuff that was in the book that's not in the Cliff Notes. And so now you can take the test and pass it. It all doesn't matter. It's all about getting ahead in life, but they still expect the teachers to grade their kids in the work. And nobody makes Johnny upset or makes his parents look bad. Right. And the problem with that is you can be affluent and wearing a tie and be just as much a cretin as somebody that doesn't own a book because they're just ignorant. So,
this is the other problem.
It's critical.
Yeah, this is the other problem. It's putting too much pressure on teachers, and then the teachers are the first one to get blamed when the system doesn't produce. Well, they're hobbled at almost every step of the way. And I get that complaint from the teachers we have here on the website that are members, that, they are literally hobbled by the system itself from performing what they want to do in the classroom. And if they're not hobbled by the system, then they're hobbled by the parents. And almost universally, this is the kind of complaint that I get in the emails. So, yeah, it's, I don't know any other solution for this other than what you say is build up your own private networks. I call it owning the culture, but that's precisely what I mean by it. Build up networks of contacts with people that have this interest and have some expertise, in whatever, and try and build things out that way. And it's going to be, the case that, like you and me, people are going to have to become autodidacts in order to obtain an education because the system is failing them.
I should have used that as a fourth option, that, you've got trade and vocation, you got liberal arts, you got, which are interdisciplinary at first and then maybe multidisciplinary later. And then you've got pure academics, which is an interesting career, not one I want. I pursued it at one time, but then you've got the sort of screw it, I'm going to go into business for myself approach. And I got to say, if I had it to do over again, I probably would have done that because I wouldn't be I'm 5 figures in debt right now for student loan. It's the only debt I have. Credit card debt, none. Car debt, none. I owe a student loan, which is really hard to make progress at through compound interest. So I'm working on it aggressively as possible, and I plan to knock it out in the next year or two. But in the meantime, it's a saddle on my back. It's a weight, an albatross. But in the meantime, what I wish I'd have done is kind of like Hank Rearden in Atlas Shrugged. I wish or
Fountainhead, you mean?
Fountainhead, yeah. I wish I'd have gone out and started my own business and just funded my own education, because I could have hired a teacher, and if he didn't fit, I could have fired him, and I could have bought whatever books I want, pursued my interests. And I just remember that what you said at the start of my undergraduate education was read what you're interested in, don't let anybody talk you out of it, and sculpt your class choices and all your papers within the classes and all your assignments in the broadest possible terms to continue pursuing your interests, but don't let somebody divert you because they would rather you focus on the economics of pottery shards in Micronesia, if what you really want to study is something else. So I've taken that to heart, and I've been an autodidact ever since. It was through that I read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and it fits with the first book I ever read, which was my grandparents, who were teachers, sent me the box set of The Lord of the Rings.
Mhm.
First time I'd ever picked up a real book, and I read those things cover to cover several times, and that ignited the whole thing. And so it fit, just stepping right into, well, heck, I'll just go buy my own books and read my own
Right.
stuff. But then you have to have the curiosity to pursue areas that aren't, just your comfort zone.
Well, we have a teacher here as a member, Daniel, that has told me that she has kind of advised her students to do the same thing. Is, keep reading what you want to do and what you're interested in addition to what the system says, because that's quite an admission. But it's something I stick with to this day, that if you are encumbered with having to ship your kids off to the public school system, encourage them in this tradition of autodidacticism, because it's very true that most of the great minds in the history of our civilization were more or less autodidacts. They weren't products of a system. So, take that for what it's worth, but I think it's worth quite a bit, and that's what I've consistently advised people to do. Go read what you're interested in. Take those bibliographies from books that you've read, and if mark the titles that look interesting, and get those books and read those books.
And over time, it gets easier and easier to weed out the ones
Absolutely.
that are derivative. I remember that people used to hand me, back in the 90s when this was the fad, people used to hand me every other New Age book and go, you need to read this. I'm like, look, I've read the books that gave those guys the ideas that,
Right.
from which they based the book. Oh, but you haven't read this. You can't judge a book by its cover. And I'm like, I absolutely can. That is derivative. They're just citing and talking about or alluding, or there's no citations, in which case it's not worth my time. But it's citing. You might as well just hand me Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which I've read, so don't give me this. And they're like, oh no, this book is unique, this person has deeper insight. And I'm like, I just don't listen to that. Or you pick up a book now that's a book on the Templars, and there's a reason it's in the bargain shelf and it's only been on the market for 6 months, and it won't be on the market 6 months from now. It's somebody basically rewrote a book that somebody else wrote, or it's
Right.
a college paper turned into a book, and it's derivative of secondhand knowledge. Why not just find if you're going to read about Charlemagne, why not read his own biographer in the court at the time?
Right.
Why not read Earhart instead of
Right.
just picking up a Barnes and Noble off-brand special on Charlemagne? And so I eventually, once you've done a few, you open books, you go, nope, derivative, you toss it aside, you follow the root to the tree.
Exactly. We've lost, again, it's going back to what you said earlier about even the teaching profession has lost its connection to that tradition to such an extent that you no longer not even know the primary sources, but you don't even know the classical secondary sources. So it's just a vicious circle, and there's nothing for it, people, but to do the hard work and do as much education on your own as possible. There's a member of the website here that has a daughter, and she goes to public school, but this person also spends a lot of time at home, exposing her to different kinds of music or literature and so on and so forth that she'll never get in school. And that's what you have to do.
Well, nobody asked me for advice, but I'll just say another thing that I've found helpful. One is spotting derivative stuff and following the tree to the root.
Right.
But the other, this is especially a propensity I've seen among homeschoolers, is not confusing the old for the good. So
Right.
let's say I want to read about the Franks, and I pick up Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks. That doesn't mean that's not a wildly distorted view
Right.
of the Franks. What I found is that you got to pick a study area and
Right.
never read one book about it. You need to read some competing books
Mhm.
about the same topic, not so you can figure out who you're going to follow. This is not about fascism and following people, but so that you can get a mix of point of view. If you're going to read Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon, then Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, you need to read an Eastern Orthodox source about
Right.
read Yaroslav Pelikan or something, but read read something. You'd probably have a better
read something else, right?
Yeah.
Read something in addition to the so-called canon, and you know, that's again, I think, to my mind, Daniel, where it's absolutely essential that education is a human process. It's not computers, it's not standardized tests. It's a human process where you're interacting with people, be it in a classroom or a seminar hall or what have you, or around a conference table. My best memories of college were precisely those kinds of classes. And we just are missing this human element, and again, that's because I think that human element is grounded in the tradition, and we've so cut ourselves off from it that, you know, we've filled it up with ersatz substitutes for that, you know, and they're not working. So I all I can do is add my, you know, thumbs up in agreement with what you're saying.
It reminds me, I want to ask you about a particular book, but I have two more questions to finish out the show. So I'll ask the two questions that are more on these topics, and then I'll hit you with the personal question that any listener wants to stick around for. We'll do it on the air.
Okay.
So there's a story. I sent you a couple of stories, a couple of links, news stories, and one of the stories, it just weirded me out. You know, this has nothing to do with who's president, as the fact that this has never been done before. But one of the stories was about presidential alerts. And so the statement in the article is, if you own a cell phone on Thursday, expect a call this Thursday. And so what they're going to do is they're going to test the emergency presidential alert system. And apparently what it is one person, the president of the United States, at his sole discretion, for any reason, it doesn't have to be an emergency, it could be anything he wants, can basically hit your phone. I mean, essentially it shuts down the other ability to do stuff, but it sends you a message or a call with any content that person wants. And what I found unnerving about this, Dr. Farrell, is if conceivably such a president wanted to do this to subvert the democratic process, or we call that a coup, or to do something that was not for our benefit and safety, and not about the aliens have landed, or watch out, there's a cataclysmic asteroid approaching. But instead, it's something personal and direct. We've never had a situation where a temporarily elected official, the only other place I can think where this has happened is in North Korea. So the leader of North Korea broadcasts stuff into your village day and night, and you can't turn it off. This is the first time we've ever had Americans be able to get a message from an elected official where you can't turn it off. And wherever you are, whatever you're doing, boom, the president's in your face. Twitter was one thing, but you don't have to listen. So does this, aside from who the president is, does this new thing, the fact that this has never been done before, does this concern you? Do you feel like that this could be used, or that this, here's the question I'm really trying to ask. Do you think that the purposes of putting this infrastructure in place are more or different than the mere thing they're describing of, well, in case there's an emergency?
Well, yes and no. As far as I understand this drill, which supposedly is being conducted under the auspices of FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Yeah.
This is, from what I've been told, and from the commercials that have been running here on the radio, and they've been constant.
I didn't know there were commercials.
Oh yeah, they've been running commercials, you know, alerting people to this test. And apparently what they're trying to do, at least from what I can gather from what they're saying on these commercials, apparently what they're trying to do is to take the old emergency broadcast system, which is television and radio primarily, and plug in to that system the whole internet, iPad, cell phone network into that system. So from that point of view, it does not disturb me.
Right. That sounds, I thought of that too. And that sounds just like a warm part. That sounds like from a time when we all had public civic duty in our minds. We all voted to listen to Dan Rather.
I have great pause in the drill itself, because recent history in this country has shown that these drills have been used to piggyback actual operations. And that's what gives me pause. Personally, I suspect that if there's any element of a coup in this, it is the element of a counter coup to make sure that there is a way for the executive branch to communicate. We are on opposite sides of the evaluation of things here. But I am as concerned as you are about the potentials here for misuse. Absolutely am.
Well, the other thing is a message sounds very benign. We're all about in America the ability to express yourself, communicate, get your messages about. It kind of makes me sick a little bit when somebody says, "What's the message this movie sends?" And I'm like, if it has a message, I ain't watching it. I'm looking at art. I don't need a message on top to piggyback on top of it.
Right.
Save that for church. But when somebody says a message, we're preconditioned to be benignly disposed to it. Now, if somebody said the opposite of that, if they said the executive branch of the government wants to be able to take over your phone or to shut down your phone or to install a piece of software on your phone or to interfere with the communication of your phone, we would all be a lot more disturbed, pissed off, and there would be a huge outcry. But it strikes me that the ability to send a message to probably the most important digital device that we're all carrying around, the thing that is the disconnected wireless infrastructure of our country, the ability to do that doesn't necessarily imply the ability to piggyback on it for other things.
Sure.
It sure makes you wonder, why couldn't they?
Well, the whole problem, as far as I'm concerned, is this whole post 9/11 surveillance state that the little shrub shackled us with.
Shrub?
That's Bush.
Oh.
I call him the little shrub.
Got it.
The whole problem here is this whole post 9/11 draconian surveillance state, FISA courts and so on, which to me are nothing but Star Chamber justice. Any way one slices it. This whole post 9/11 thing, I think, is really the root of the problem. And until people wake up and realize that this whole thing has to be unwound and gotten rid of, because the idea of mass surveillance on everybody is, as far as I'm concerned, it's just not constitutional. Any way you slice it, it's just not. And the potentials for abuse, which we've seen recently, the potentials for abuse are certainly there. And it's just time to acknowledge the fact that we don't need any of that.
Well, the other concern I have is that, there's a saying among older network guys. I'm talking about the guys that were there when networks were first a thing, not the 20-year-old kids who seem to trust every little thing, every little piece of software they put together, that it's bulletproof and that life will go on. The kid thing has changed our sense of security a lot. We're overconfident. But the older guys will say that all networks are hackable, that any network can be breached. Any network is available for misuse. It doesn't mean you don't do everything in your power to work on it, but it means a continual diligence and vigilance and a constant testing of the network and improvement of it. And I think anything that could potentially access the entire United States cellular network could potentially shut down the entire cellular network. And it doesn't matter that we say, oh yeah, but it's only if the president feels like he needs to tweet out something important to us. And since you don't look at Twitter, he's going to do it right to your phone. I think, well, yeah, but what if it's not the president? Even assuming that, it's like, I did not sleep with that porn star. Great message. Thanks. I was busy. But what about the hackers that get into the system?
Precisely.
Convert that system for their own use. The mere fact that this is another principle of network technology. The fact that it is global, not cellularized, like a cell group is hard to nail down and subvert. But a single network, the advantage to control a single network is that once you hack it, you have it all. Right. It's like the Emerald City.
Right.
And so it's just a giant target, and it's the easier thing to hack, no matter who's got security.
It's like Catherine Austin Fitts always reminds people: there is no cyber system that is ultimately secure. the potential for misuse, the potential for hacking, that somebody can come in and literally hijack a network. All of this is there.
But this is why cryptocurrency offers some possibilities, because a distributed network is always safer and harder to hack in general.
Right.
I could have said always, but in general, it's safer and harder to hack than a non-distributed centralized network. And the moment you take a bunch of distributed networks and you centralize them with a single control mechanism, you just made it much easier to hack.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
It bothers me. Who the hell might gain control of
the potential for all of these systems to be hacked, to be misused is there. And, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's a matter of going back and undoing this whole post 9/11 surveillance culture. And for that matter, I'm on the view now, or recently come to the view, that all of these big platforms are approaching the point that they are beyond public utilities. They need to be closely watched. But that problem, that affords another problem. Do we trust the government right now to do that? And quite frankly, I haven't trusted the government since the assassination of JFK. So, we're faced with all sorts of problems. So yeah, I this drill thing disturbs me very much. This whole thing that you're talking about, it disturbs me very, very much. The dangers in it are just too big.
Well, I'm aware already. I've seen too many updates to my Google Docs and my Apple stuff to be under any illusion that a governmental power would be unable to gain access to everything.
Sure.
Almost immediately. I think it's probably all just sitting there waiting for somebody to poke the right button. They don't even need a password, and boom, they're in, despite the attempts of some of these companies to actually resist some of that, including Apple. But whether they can or not is another matter. But I kind of live with it. I feel like, I got to get stuff done. Life's too short. I don't think I'm not giving anybody a reason to focus on me personally. I'm not that important. I would rather they didn't steal my ideas for articles I'm going to write, and then the same article comes out a month before I publish. That pisses me off when that happens, or when something looks like that happens. But as far as these networks go, I don't know that the government is in a place to tear them apart, because I think the government needs them to exist in order to gain centralized.
Well, yeah, that's the problem.
They are the vehicle for the government.
Yeah, that's the problem. A lot of these platforms, you mentioned Google. Well, it's a fairly well-known thing that Google's connections with the intelligence community, for that matter, Amazon, they're there and they're palpable. So yeah, this is the problem I have with all these people talking about regulation and busting these cartels up. You're back to square one, because in order to do that, you're relying on yet another central authority to do it. So, I've gone to the extreme, Daniel, that anymore my most sensitive things I do not write on a computer that's online. I actually have an offline computer that I do all of my things on now, because I've had the same thing happen to me that's happened to you. You write an article and then bang, someone else puts out an article on the same subject before you do and gives it a slightly different spin. I've had that happen too many times with some of my books, and I'm just done with it. So,
but I'm sure you know this, but that a computer can be completely unplugged from the internet for its whole life, and we can still yank whatever we want off of it easily. You need either one, you need the right equipment to basically just pick up the patterns the computer is putting out,
right?
So you can duplicate its screen, or you need to just break in once and shove a thumb drive in it for a few seconds, and pretty soon it's broadcasting.
Yeah. I take as many precautions as I can. I am aware of that, but
at some point, you got to just throw in the towel and go, look, if somebody wants it, they're going to have to take it. Well, and that's how I feel, and that's why I think a lot of the foot stamping about breaking up these companies is all for show. It's foot stamping because they're not really going to do it because they need it, or they think. Well, all right. So the last question of the show I wanted to ask you. was about another article. I sent you an article about disinfectants being used more and more in households. Instead of buying the regular dishwashing liquid, we buy the antibacterial dishwashing liquid, the antibacterial hand soap, the antibacterial this and that, antifungal, whatever, bed sheets. And what they're finding is in infant fecal samples, they're finding increases in certain hormones and ingredients that interfere with our ability to modulate and digest sugars and to avoid obesity. And they're finding these in pretty large quantities. And this correlates with another recent news article. I don't mean it correlates in the sense, I don't mean cause and effect. I literally just mean correlate, but it correlates with, for anybody listening, it correlates with another article that 7 states in the US have recently hit the 35% obesity mark. So in 7 states in the US, 35% of the populace is technically obese.
Right.
Even if you just go, well, it's technically, that's some pretty big people overall. And they don't all have hormone issues that they were born with. That, there's some issues about diet and lifestyle and cultural attitude that you can correlate with all of that. But there are also these issues of chemicals exacerbating the effect. So my question to you is, where are we going with this trend? Because it strikes me that aside from whether it's orchestrated or not, aside from whether we need to just, for goodness sake, eat a salad once in a while and walk to work or not, it strikes me that if we keep going on like this, the species doesn't last. I mean, you can only reach a level where you got people dying at 45 again from blood clots because they're too big. And they're having their legs amputated from diabetes because they just kept eating and eating. That at some point the species is imperiled.
Yeah.
So I don't know what to think about this trend, but we're rocketing toward it.
We are rocketing toward it, and it's, I didn't have time to read that particular article, but it's endemic of a general pattern, and the pattern is, particularly in this country, we think any technological or even pseudo-technological thing is ipso facto good, and there's no consequence to the environment, and we go ahead and release all this stuff into public consumption. The big thing here that I'm really focused on is GMOs, and there is a GMO obesity link, but there's nothing wrong with just plain good old-fashioned soap rather than your antifungal, antibacterial thing. I use good old-fashioned soap, to be quite honest with you. I don't buy all of this fancy stuff with the disinfectant and blah blah blah.
Hard stuff, lava.
Yeah, the hard stuff, lava. Yeah, precisely. I use lava soap. I use some others, but they're old names, that I grew up with. We're getting, I'm in agreement with you. We're so addicted to these technological solutions without having ever done any long-term intergenerational studies of their effects. I mean, we're paying the piper big time now for the FDA crawling into bed with Monster Santo, or vice versa, depending on who you read, and okaying GMOs at the same time that we're allowing these companies to patent their seeds and then drive farmers out of business. We've got to get a grip on this idea that if it's new, it's not necessarily good. If it's a big, shiny technological thing, it's not necessarily good. I don't know what else to say other than just quit buying this crap. I try and eat as much organic food as I'm able to afford. I know that even that now, according to studies, has been so corrupted by herbicides and so on and so forth that there is no such thing in this country anymore. And that's the problem. We're poisoning everything. And like you say, it doesn't matter if it's by design or not. The fact is it's happening. So, try and eat as healthy as you can. Get off of this technology stuff. It just goes nowhere. If you want a disinfectant, use bleach or hydrogen peroxide. Those are the old standbys and they still work. you know, if this disinfectant stuff was really all of that, all it's cracked up to be, every county health department in this country is telling you the wrong thing when they say put bleach in your dishwater when you're washing dishes in the bar, and so on and so forth. And they're not, you know, they're not telling you to go out and buy the latest anti-disinfectant, antifungal soap for extra pennies on the dollar. It's just nuts. It's totally nuts.
Well, I'm sure there's someone somewhere that needs antifungal, but I think until you have that, you know, maybe a presidential alert, you have fungus. Until that happens, I don't think
You
you
have
need
fungus.
to proactively, yeah, avoid the antifungal until the fungus rears its ugly.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if they made an anti-obesity soap now, we'd probably be in good shape, right? Wash your hands, you won't feel hungry. Well, that's a good idea. We should patent that. So I'm going to ask you my personal question then, which is the show is, we'll call it effectively over, but I would like to get this in.
Is this on the record or off?
Oh, on the record.
Okay, hang on. Let me take a little nature break. I'll be right back.
Uh-oh. Dr. Farrell is taking a nature break. This is him at the tree. Enjoy it, Dr. Farrell. Oh, I just wanted to, we have the webcam on you out there peeing, so
Okay, thank you.
want to make sure we caught that on camera.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I wanted to ask you, one of the things that, you know, there's different kinds of homeschoolers. There's the sort of West Coast, Portland origin homeschooling movement that originally started a long ago. I forget John, what's his name in that book called Monday something, but I would call it sort of hippie homeschoolers. That's one homeschooling movement. And the second homeschooling movement started in the 80s and was sort of a response to the rise of the evangelical right. It was that kind of homeschooling. And I saw that in the Midwest. And the biggest thing that I saw next to the Bible, of course, being a homeschooling text, was the works of Josephus.
Yes.
I always wondered, are the works of Josephus worth studying at all?
Yeah.
And if so, maybe you could elaborate on that.
Well, they are, because he is the only extra biblical source from an early period that refers to the events of the fall of Jerusalem, refers to Christ, refers to the Roman occupation, and so on. He certainly does have his agenda. I mean, if you read him closely, but it is definitely worth reading. I would suspect that most of the people that were homeschooling and using Josephus as a source really didn't know all of the ins and outs of Josephus, and as a consequence were not aware of the importance of some of the things that he was actually saying. to give you a little for example, there's a place in the Antiquities of the Jews that refers to Christ as, quote, the Egyptian, unquote. And again, that's probably a reference that most of those homeschoolers were not picking up on, that this is the way that he was referring to it. And they probably therefore didn't understand the significance of it. But personally, yeah, I think the works are definitely worth studying, but doing so without the evangelical fundamentalist spectacles on. That's the key point there. Now, there's some people out there, to give you a flip side, there's some people out there that believe that Josephus was involved with the Flavians. He was, of course, adopted by Titus Flavius, and that believe that he was part of some big Flavian conspiracy to create Christianity whole cloth. I'm thinking of Joseph Atwell in his book Caesar's Messiah. The problem there is, if you're going to do a revisionist history of that period, let's say from the fall of Jerusalem up to Council of Nicaea, that first 300 years, you have to do a much better job of it than Atwell does, because there's so much to take into consideration. And I've said this many times in the vid chats, Daniel, for people that ask me to do something like that. And I keep telling them that what you're asking is really, I think, beyond the ability of any one scholar to do, because you'd have to master so much diverse types of material. But that said, I don't think you're going to get that kind of mastery from the homeschooler crowd that you're talking about with respect to Josephus.
Well, no. Even when I read the King James Bible, I come away with an exponentially different understanding of any given part of it than the evangelicals do. I'm not knocking them or denying them their viewpoint, but I certainly don't share it.
Well, the King James Bible, just to remind the evangelical fundamentalists, not that we have any here on this website, but no, the King James, the King James Bible was an Anglican, it was an Anglican production, and the Douay Rheims Roman Catholic Bible was kind of the Roman Catholicization of the King James Bible. So, it was produced by an entirely different sort of ecclesiastical culture than the modern evangelical, and it never ceases to amaze me why they stick with it, because it's an Anglican production, and a production from a period in Anglican history that was relatively high church to boot. So I've never been able to figure that one out.
Many of them don't. They're using anything from the New International Version to the New Revised Standard Version, or New American Bible. Mm-hmm. But I think that one's Catholic, actually. But maybe that's the New Jerusalem. But I saw a lot of that. It depends on if you're on the sort of Dallas Theological Seminary end of things and Pentecostal end of things. It's more NIV. Mm-hmm. But I can't go back to thinking in those ways. The first time I read a verse and I see something about a chalice, I'm immediately thinking about communion, and not some symbolic, metaphorical thing, as if a chalice couldn't possibly exist in real life.
Well, the problem with those Bible versions that outside of the King James that so many of them are using is, and they don't realize this, is that they're using reconstructions of the text of the New Testament that are the result of a particular theory. Basically the old Westcott and Hort theory dressed up a bit in terms of the latest scholarly findings. And what they don't realize is that they're not reading any sort of traditional text. And this is the other problem with those things, not to mention some egregious, just flat out egregious translational errors. Or
just some hideously unpoetic ones.
Or just some hideously unpoetic ones. Yeah, there's that element too. I used to know the emeritus professor of English from the University of Alabama, Dr. Ward Allen, who wrote a wonderful book called The King James Translators, trying to explain the difference of translational philosophy that went behind that version and the translational philosophy of the so-called modern versions, and it's night and day. And I've even talked about this on some vid chats before, that, you know, the reason that the King James is so hard to read is that it's trying to capture as many of the different levels of meaning in the Greek text that it was working with as possible. And the modern tendency is always to translate the simplest and most obvious meaning and get rid of all the others. So, you know, it's, you know, we could go on and on about translations here, but
well, you gave me an illustration that I've never forgotten and I find useful, not for myself, but you know, these days I usually refuse to talk with them, but I only meet people who get their ideas from Wikipedia, and there's not enough information there. It's like you can't read Wikipedia for 5 minutes and sum up 5,000 years of history, you know. Right. So, but they do, and but they do. Maybe they arrive at the fact that the King James is based on the majority text, or the Textus Receptus, or the received text, depending on how you want to phrase it or analyze it. The idea of a received text and the idea of a majority text are two different things too.
Right.
So which one do you want to focus on? But you gave me a useful illustration that I will occasionally use for other people. So you talked about the Mendelion. I have one right up here that was hand painted for me. This is the Holy Napkin icon in the Orthodox Church. It looks like an image of Christ's face pressed against a napkin, because the story is that's how the original was created. And you talked once about the Fourth Crusade, and talked about maybe it wasn't the fourth, but I think it was. You talked about the desecration of the altar and the invasion of Byzantium, and mentioned that there was something going on in the minds of the Western, not conquistador, crusaders, that same thing, that was not going on in the minds of the East. And it seemed, you averred then that it seemed to be the hunt for talismans of power, and the acquisition of the original of certain things, the acquisition of certain original pieces of art and ancient things, etc. And so, of course, there was a huge movement of relics and art and scientific implements and books and other things like that to the West from the East, which accounts for a lot of the West's sudden Renaissance. Right. It literally stole the stuff to credit. But with the Holy Napkin in particular, you pointed out that the original wasn't important in the East, that every icon of the Holy Napkin was equally venerable and was venerable. And then, so the idea that you're going to get the Holy Napkin as where's the right one, where's the correct one, that just wasn't an Eastern thing. It was in the West. And so it was the proliferation of the icon of the icon of the icon that that the East understood. And so I used that for the majority text, that, you know, even if there was some original book somewhere, like the so-called original Greek, that you could locate and go, this is the book, this is the first one, it wouldn't matter. What matters is the copies. What matters is the received text of the majority that went everywhere. And so it's not the attempt to get back to the original, which is what Westcott and Hort and those new revised versions, et cetera, are trying to do, to reconstruct an original through spiritual archaeology, but it is to ascertain what has been the tradition of the church that it is used since time immemorial, and that's the majority text.
Well, let me give you a problem with Westcott and Hort that has been dodged by most contemporary biblical scholars. When Westcott and Hort, and if people don't know who they are, these were two Anglican bishops in the late 19th century that came up with a theory of the transmission of the text of the New Testament that bypassed entirely the so-called majority text, or Textus Receptus, and concentrated on 4 manuscripts that they believed to be closer to the original, and that was the Codex Sinaiticus and so on and so forth. And according to their theory, and at that time, there did not exist any manuscript prior to the 3rd century that contained a majority text reading. And the problem for that theory is Papyrus 74 was eventually, I think it was 74, 73 or 74, was eventually discovered. This was long after the theory had been promulgated and then, you know, percolated throughout all the seminaries of all the different churches. The problem was that lo and behold, finally a papyrus was discovered, I think it was 74, that contained a majority text reading from the 2nd century. So, the theory is already out there, and the exception didn't do anything to discourage promoting the theory. So again, texts of anything are always a matter of some problem for theories like that, particularly theories that are constructed on a very narrow basis of data like theirs was. And then they made the claim that, well, since there's no extant reading or text of a majority text prior to this period, we're going with this theory. So, it's another one of those Hegelian cases where the exception has conjured forth the Hegelian response. Well, then so much the worse for the facts.
But I was always suspicious of this approach for one simple reason, that I forget the 4 initials that represent the 4 texts they were trying to reconstruct. Do you remember what I mean? It's like
it's Aleph is Codex. Aleph, the Hebrew character Aleph, is Codex Sinaiticus. Then you had the Codex Vaticanus, and you had the Codex that's in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I forget the name of it right off the top of my head. But there were these 4 documents, and yeah, they had letters.
The shorthand was the 4 letters.
Right.
But I was suspicious of it because it seemed to be, it's like there's an elephant in the room and you're intentionally ignoring him. It makes it more obvious. It seemed to me that look, there's a Greek church who's been using the Greek Bible since there was a Greek Bible, and they were using it when they were Jews. It's called the Septuagint, and it's still there. So why would you? Why would you try to rediscover the missing text when
the problem with the Septuagint is that that's an Old Testament text. The Septuagint is
the Greek
but that has nothing to do with Westcott and Hort. That has nothing to do with Westcott and Hort.
Yeah, but the Greek text within the Church of the New Testament was also in use in the Greek Church. And
right.
It strikes me that if you want to go back to the original, you go back to you forget trying to go back to the Hebrew. You're not Hebrews. You go back to the most recent Western translation, the received translation of the Old Testament in the form of the Septuagint, and you go back to the Byzantine text in the form of the New Testament.
Well, this is
there in front of you. It's parallel.
This is another problem that's just recently come out in Old Testament scholarship. Is that there's now a theory out there that the Septuagint is actually the oldest surviving edition of the Old Testament, and that the Hebrew text is actually a kind of a recension of that, and that the Septuagint arises out of a group of Jewish scholars, which is, the traditional story, that are working in Alexandria. But the new twist is that they're using and relying on Berosus, the Babylonian priest that Alexander got to draw up the history of Babylon for the conquering Greeks, and the same thing in Egypt, that they're relying on Manetho. And through detailed comparison of readings of books in the Old Testament, they're now coming to the conclusion, some scholars are anyway, that they're coming to the conclusion that these books are the product of this kind of recension. So, this is why doing any sort of history of these things is so very difficult, because the scholarship keeps changing in radical ways. And you're right. In the process, what they're doing is they're trying to avoid having to look at the primary received text, and that's the problem.
Where I was kind of leading with that is just that if you're going to ignore the texts currently in use by the Christian people who spoke the language in which they were written, I mean, right. I would respect attempting to go back to the Church of Jerusalem, oldest church, at one time first in honor before Rome, and trying to recover a Jerusalem translation of both New and Old Testament. I would respect if there was some attempt to do that and such a thing existed, and there was a Jerusalem text type we could use. But you go to the Byzantine Church, and it just strikes me that if they're speaking Greek, they're singing the liturgy in Greek. It's rife with the scripture in Greek. Part of the liturgy is the scripture in Greek, and it is both the Septuagint of the Old Testament and the Byzantine, or whatever you want to call it, the Syrian or Antiochian type, however you want to name the Byzantine text of the New Testament. The only logic I could find in the 19th century of trying to put together an alternative textual narrative would be to try to build an alternative religion that looks like Christianity, but in fact ignores the last almost 2,000 years of that very same religion.
Well, if you read Westcott and Hort themselves carefully, that is pretty much what they admit to be trying to do. So, in other words, there is, if you actually go to them, in other words, if you want to learn the Westcott and Hort theory, not from your seminary professor, but from Westcott and Hort themselves, and actually read their book, this is pretty much admitted that this is what they're trying to do. So it is.
It sounds like an attempt. You tell me. It sounds like an attempt to create a non-ecclesiastical religion, freed from the mores of both apostolic succession and its rootedness.
What they set out to do, and what they acknowledged that they're doing, is they're trying to put the text into the hands of scholarship as being the magisterium for what's true.
Right.
And this has always been the problem with it. And like I say, you don't find any New Testament critics that are really pointing out the fact that the existence of a papyrus that has a reading of a text type that is not part of their standard theory has made no effect whatsoever on contemporary scholarship. It has not called any of that into question. And that to me is a huge problem. But it's problems like this that make any sort of, I sat down and read through Caesar's Messiah, Joseph Atwell's book, and he makes interesting arguments. At times they can be persuasive arguments, but the problem is nowhere in the book is he looking at the text types that he's dealing with. So I'm thinking, well, what is this really worth in the final analysis? Not too much. That's the problem here. And
so it strikes me that this is very much like the pure academics that we mentioned earlier, and Plato's Republic essentially trying to take over. I found those people to be the most annoying people in religion. The guy that says, forget the little pious lady over there who prays for all the sick, and forget what the priest is doing right now. I am the scholar who find all of you to be ignorant because I've graduated from seminary, and I shall tell you what it says in the original.
Well, my big beef
and shape the view of
my big beef, Daniel, with that whole approach was the simple fact that the Greek that they teach you in seminaries is not Greek that any Greek would speak. It's
instructing Aramaic. I mean, that's dubious on its face.
Well, there's so much about biblical scholarship that in the final analysis is very dubious, because the theories that are promoted as acceptable scholarship have highly dubious logic. The confusion of a reading of a text with the manuscript of a text. This is one of the most blatant things out there, and there are two different things. That's the whole documentary hypothesis is shot through with that confusion. So and along comes this new theory about the Septuagint and its relationship to Manetho and Berosus, and yet again, everything is thrown into a cocked hat, and it's making absolutely no ripple whatsoever, as far as I can tell, in mainstream critical theory. So,
I remember walking home from college in the year or two before I moved into the one in which you were teaching, and I used to have to walk home a long ways, and I would sing the I think we'd met because I'd sing the Ninefold Kyrie back then. And I
Mhm.
remember somebody had followed me home. They were so pissed off at something I'd said in philosophy class. That happened more than once. They were following me and they were insistent on engaging in the debate. And somebody followed me, and I heard a voice behind me about a block away said, "You're singing it wrong." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" It's like, it's 3 times, not 9, and it's the same thing every time. And I'm like, "No, it isn't." And it's the abbreviation versus the
Yeah.
reading. It's the abbreviation versus the thing itself.
Well, there's no arguing with
You open the book
invincible.
and you think dot 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 in your prayer book is what you're actually supposed to say. You just
There's no arguing with invincible ignorance. There really isn't. I've been around that with so many people that it's not even funny. But at a certain point, I'm like you. I just throw up my hands and don't bother to discuss with them because they've got their ideas in their head from somewhere, and it's not really to the point. So yeah, it's Josephus. Josephus is important, but those people that are looking at Josephus, they need to be aware of the fact that he has an agenda. There's an excellent book out, a series of books by an Anglican scholar. I forget what his name was, back in the 17th or 18th century. That was a serious study of the Talmud and the allusions to the Talmud in the New Testament, and throw that one into the evangelical crowd someday and see what response you get. Because
more than once, St. Paul quotes Aesop.
Oh yeah, well, it's constant. It's constant, and it's again back to the sources. Do we really want to go there, or do we not? And most people don't. So
Well, it's fun to consider. It seems like a webinar on textual criticism is called.
No. I did that in God History Dialectic. I'm done with it. I don't want to go back and redo
necessarily religious text. I mean the ability to parse a text for assumptions versus the reading versus the.
That's what I mean. I did that in God History, and I don't want to tangle with Derrida and all of that stuff, which to me, looking at it now, had I been more attuned to Derrida at the time, I probably would have used him as an example of how not to read texts, and use those theories as an example of proto-Derrida type of.
See, don't throw rocks at the student. Just
don't throw rocks.
Because the poetic irony of it.
Throw a book of Derrida, yes.
That's right. You got to have an umbrella in Dr. Farrell's class. Yes. There's copies of Derrida and rocks being thrown around. You got to hide.
Yeah, well, Derrida, Foucault is another one that I think terribly messed up some types of scholarship. So
now Foucault's pendulum, although I like the Panopticon, but Foucault's pendulum is actually, I think that's Jeremy Bentham. Foucault's Pendulum is a great book, though, by Umberto Eco.
Yeah, Foucault's Pendulum is a good book, but it's Foucault's Pendulum and Foucault are two different things.
Two different things.
Yeah, the whole critical world, not just with biblical scholarship, but I have a friend that teaches English, and he's so fed up with the influence of that similar type of thinking in secular criticism that he's just beside himself. So
right.
I don't know, maybe sometime I will get around to doing a webinar like that, but for the moment, people are just going to have to be satisfied with what I said about good old Westcott and Hort and Julius Wellhausen and company. Because it's.
I remember I was thinking when I said that about Foucault, and the Panopticon is Bentham, but Foucault's book I'm thinking of was The Birth of the Clinic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Foucault, Fernand Braudel, a lot of those people that picked up on that way of criticism, and it's been very, very harmful. And then that got wedded to the whole Frankfurt School and Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno and people like that. It's frustrating.
Maybe at some point we ought to put together the canon of suggested reading. There's a variety. I forget the name of that Roman Catholic. What do you call a grand historian? A Roman Catholic grand historian that wrote so many volumes. You probably remember who I mean.
Etienne Gilson.
Spell the last name for me. I can't speak French.
Gilson.
No, not Gilson. This is before that. Older.
It's Gilson.
Oh, okay. Well,
French.
if I meet Gilson, I'll tell him to stop calling himself that. No, okay. But no, I'm thinking of there's go back maybe 100 years before that, and there's a grand historian, a French one, but one of many back when you go that far.
French.
Yeah, I can't think of it off the top of my. I can just picture the books, multi-volume, red set, engraved, and it's like Yves something.
Yves Congar.
It's not Father Congar. It's somebody else. I'll think of it. I'll find it, and I'll ask you about it. But I'm just thinking, there things like this. I've wondered. I'm like, what about this guy? Is it too Catholic, or is he going to be reasonable with this?
Well, those old Roman Catholic scholars, I have a great deal of respect for. Copleston, people like that, because they were able to drill down remarkably well into things, and they weren't on any bandwagons.
I had all that Jesuitical thinking.
They had a tradition of scholarship, particularly in France, at some of this écoles supérieures that were quite good.
Trivium and quadrivium, right? So
yeah, they were quite good, and but I can't, for the life of me, I can't think of French writer of broad history right off the top of my head that you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll find it. You'll go, oh, of course, when I find it. I can't remember it. Wasn't prepared. Well, it might be an interesting show one day to piece through the canon available things. Obviously, Copleston, if you can get a hold of, depending on which books, but which series, but if you can get a hold of that stuff. Some of that stuff now, it's collector's items in the price.
Yeah, I know. They are taking out of circulation all of those old scholarly works, and that upsets me tremendously. That really upsets me.
I think a lot of the people too that have them aren't letting them go. If you can get some of them, there's reprints and they're the big glossy paperback things, but if you can get the little pocket size handheld ones that are just beloved, it's like getting the box set of the Lord of the Rings. If you grew up with that is the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, well, Copleston was available in that format years and years ago. I don't know if he's still available or not, but
right.
But yeah, they're just trying to take out so much scholarly material that it's not even funny. It breaks my heart. They're cutting people off from a grand tradition that whether you're Roman Catholic or Christian or atheist or what, but that scholarship was well received by just about everybody when it came out, and we don't have anything similar today. We don't have those kinds of minds or intellects.
Well, at least I can ask my Google Home a question. I do get decent answers once in a while. I get some fun ones too.
Yeah, if you're not directed to Wikipedia.
That's where it gets a lot of its answers. That's right.
Yeah, well,
according to Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Who is Dr. Joseph P. Farrell?
Well, there for a while, they took me out of their thing altogether. I don't know if they ever put me back, but
no, I don't think so. I think you're in the.
I'm in the Neverland.
You're in one of the French versions or something. But I think there was definitely a concerted campaign to get you out, and it was all based on. In the end, it's just bald-faced claims, like you never went to Oxford at all. It's mythology, and so then you say, yeah, he went to Oxford. Here's the freaking diploma. Remember, I asked you for that stuff.
Yeah.
And then they say, well, it's insufficient evidence, and it's like, all right, well, you're selectively applying that rule. Do you really have Stephen Hawking's diploma?
Yeah.
Like it's not right. So anyway, you can't beat it.
No, I'm not terribly worried or concerned about beating it anyway.
Right. Well, with that, we should probably end the show. It stopped right.
All right, sir.
Mark. So we can start our draining period.
Enjoy.
All right.
Talk to you later.